In ancient Rome, clothes didn't just cover your body, they broadcasted your resume, your tax bracket, and your ambitions, all in one draped package. If you wore the wrong thing, you weren't just a fashion disaster, you were breaking the law. Yes, Rome was a place where the government cared less about potholes and more about whether your tunic had too much purple on it. Let's start with the toga, that majestic, impractical sheet of fabric. For Romans, the toga wasn't optional. It was practically a citizenship test. A free Roman man had to wear it on official occasions, and how you styled it revealed exactly where you stood in society. Senators wore a toga with a broad purple stripe called the latus clavus. Equestrians got a thinner purple stripe, the angustus clavus, and everyone else just a plain white toga that screamed, "Hi, I'm middle management," and heaven forbid you wore the wrong one. A non-senator trying to pass off a broad purple stripe was basically committing ancient identity theft. It wasn't just tacky, it was illegal. Imagine being pulled aside by Roman fashion police. "Excuse me, sir, but you are clearly not a senator. Please remove that stripe before we remove it for you." Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, the weirdest rules ancient Romans actually followed, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Purple, in particular, was the most tightly controlled color. Why? Because it was ludicrously expensive. Tyrian purple dye was made from thousands of crushed sea snails, and each snail produced only a droplet of pigment. It could take tens of thousands just to dye a single garment. So when an emperor said only he could wear a full purple toga, he wasn't just protecting his authority, he was protecting his snail budget. Ordinary citizens could wear a dash of purple here or there, but strutting around in a full-on purple robe was like walking into the Senate with a neon sign that said, "Please arrest me." And it wasn't only men who faced wardrobe restrictions. Roman women, too, were subjected to sumptuary laws, regulations about what they could wear, how much jewelry was acceptable, and even the type of fabrics they used. For example, laws occasionally limited women from flaunting excessive gold or pearls. The idea was to keep upper-class women from turning every public gathering into a fashion show. Of course, wealthy Roman women had a way of interpreting restrictions as suggestions, and many simply found loopholes. If a law banned 10 gold rings, they'd just stack 9 really big ones. One particularly juicy controversy came during the Lex Oppia, a law from the Second Punic War, around 215 BCE, that restricted women from wearing more than half an ounce of gold, from riding in carriages within the city, and from wearing brightly colored garments. Why? Because Rome was at war with Hannibal, and the government wanted to cut down on public extravagance. The result? Roman women staged protests in the streets when the war ended, and the law wasn't repealed fast enough. They argued that if men could celebrate victories with triumphal parades, then women should at least be allowed to sparkle in public. Spoiler alert, the women won. The Lex Oppia was repealed, proving that if you try to take away Roman women's jewelry, you're going to have a very loud day at the Forum. But clothes in Rome weren't just about gender, they were about class, rank, and morality. Sumptuary laws aimed to keep the lower classes from dressing above their station. The rich had to look rich, the poor had to look poor, and heaven forbid anyone tried to blur the line. A freedman, for example, couldn't dress like a senator, no matter how much money he made afterward. The Romans believed appearances upheld social order, and if everyone looked the same, how would you know who to bow to? And it gets even more specific. Certain jobs came with certain uniforms and restrictions. Prostitutes, for example, were required to wear the toga instead of the traditional stola, the long dress worn by respectable women. This turned the toga from a proud male garment into, well, a scarlet letter in fabric form when worn by women. That way you didn't need Tinder to figure out someone's profession. Of course, fashion in Rome wasn't just regulated, it was weaponized. Emperors passed laws to curb what they saw as excess or decadence, but they themselves often ignored those rules when it suited them. Emperor Nero, for instance, was fond of elaborate jewel-studded outfits that made traditionalists clutch their pearls, or rather, their legally permissible half-ounce of pearls. Meanwhile, Emperor Elagabalus took things to a whole new level by wearing women's clothing in public, which wasn't just socially shocking but technically against the carefully policed Roman gender norms. The whole system created a world where clothes were less about personal style and more about survival. If you dressed above your class, you risked fines, ridicule, or worse. If you dressed below it, you risked looking like you didn't belong in your own social circle. It was a constant balancing act between legality and vanity. So next time you complain about modern dress codes, remember, in ancient Rome, breaking the rules of fashion wasn't just a faux pas, it was a crime. Imagine the police today ticketing you for wearing too much bling at Walmart. Or worse. Imagine the DMV refusing your license renewal because your purple scarf looked a little too senatorial. The Romans didn't just wear their hearts on their sleeves, they wore their legal status, their wealth, and their dignity there too. If you were a Roman citizen, there was one garment you couldn't escape, the toga. And if you thought skinny jeans were uncomfortable, imagine walking around in a woolen bedsheet that could weigh up to 20 pounds, had no buttons, and required the folding skills of an origami master. Wearing a toga wasn't just about fashion, it was a public duty, a legal expectation, and a test of how long you could endure without tripping over yourself in front of your neighbors. The toga was more than clothing, it was a uniform of citizenship. Free Roman men were expected to wear it at official occasions, public festivals, and in the law courts. Not wearing a toga in the wrong setting could get you barred from ceremonies, mocked by your peers, or even fined. It was Rome's way of saying, "Congratulations, you're a citizen. Now put on this itchy wool blanket and pretend you're dignified." But here's the catch. There were rules about how you wore the toga, and not just casual guidelines, actual, nitpicky instructions. A toga had to be wrapped just so, with the folds draped over the left shoulder and leaving the right arm free. Too loose, and you looked like you were going to bed. Too tight, and you looked like a burrito. And if you exposed the wrong amount of tunic underneath, congratulations, you'd just committed a fashion misdemeanor. The historian Quintilian even lectured on the proper way to wear a toga, noting that the fold should fall with a certain carelessness, but not too much. So yes, Romans actually had handbooks on toga etiquette. Imagine hiring a stylist, not for glamour but to make sure you didn't accidentally reveal too much ankle in court. The toga was also seasonal torture. In summer, it trapped heat like a woolen oven. In winter, it left one arm perpetually exposed to the cold. And since it was required at public events, there was no excuse. Citizens couldn't just swap it for something more comfortable. The law demanded you dress like a respectable Roman dignity was apparently worth heat stroke. Now, failing to appear properly dressed wasn't just about looking sloppy, it was seen as disrespectful to the gods, the state, and society itself. In the forum, showing up without a toga could make you stand out like someone wearing pajamas to a wedding. Worse, it could get you kicked out of official gatherings. Cicero once ridiculed his enemies by mocking their failure to wear the toga correctly, equating bad draping with bad character. In Rome, your toga wasn't just wool, it was your reputation. And then there were the special togas. A citizen's standard white toga, toga virilis, wasn't the only type. If you were a candidate for office, you wore a specially whitened toga, toga candida, so bright it practically shouted, "Vote for me." If you were in mourning, you donned a darker toga. Generals in triumph wore purple-bordered versions. The toga was a legal billboard announcing your role, your mood, and your career ambitions. But mess up which one to wear, and you'd look like you were campaigning at a funeral. The rules around toga wearing got so serious that during the reign of Augustus, laws were introduced requiring men to wear togas in the forum and at games. No toga, no entry. Augustus wanted the Roman citizen body to look unified, dignified, and distinctly Roman. Tunics alone weren't cutting it. Togas were the woolly glue that held the empire together. Citizens grumbled, but the law was the law. Think of it as the world's earliest and most uncomfortable dress code. And it wasn't only about being forced to wear the toga, it was about being forced to wear it well. Messy folds were considered shameful. Slaves often had the job of dressing their masters, carefully arranging the fabric so the wearer looked impressive rather than like a tangled curtain. Of course, this meant that one strong gust of wind could undo an hour's worth of careful wrapping. Imagine sitting in court trying to argue your innocence while your toga slowly slides off your shoulder like a Roman striptease. Critics of the toga rules weren't silent either. Roman satirists mocked the garment constantly, pointing out how impractical it was. The poet Martial once joked that the toga was such a nuisance that people avoided the forum just to escape wearing it. And who could blame them? If you spilled wine or olive oil on a toga, washing it wasn't simple. You basically had to hand it over to professional cleaners who beat clothes with urine. Yes, your dignity relied on a garment that smelled faintly of public latrines, but perhaps the best way to capture how serious Rome was about toga decorum is this. When emperors wanted to humiliate citizens or officials, one punishment was making them appear in public without a toga, or with one worn incorrectly. Losing your toga was like losing your status, your respect, and half your self-worth in a single swoop. Rome had no patience for sloppy dresses, so the next time you grumble about modern formal wear, a suit and tie, a stiff dress, an itchy collar, just remember the Roman toga. It wasn't just a garment, it was a national law, a cultural expectation, and a 20-pound reminder that citizenship came with strings attached. Or, in this case, folds attached. The toga wasn't comfortable. It was basically a bedsheet with performance anxiety. Love in ancient Rome wasn't left to chance, Cupid, or a particularly charming dinner invitation. No, in Rome, love, and more importantly marriage, was legislated, and not in the vague marriage is a good thing sense. We're talking laws that told you who to marry, when to marry, and what happened if you didn't. Forget dating apps. The state was your matchmaker, and your profile picture was basically your family lineage. The mastermind behind Rome's most famous marriage rules was Emperor Augustus, the man who transformed Rome from a messy republic into a shiny new empire. Augustus wasn't just interested in politics and building monuments. He wanted to build families too, lots of them. Why? Because Rome needed citizens. More citizens meant more soldiers, more taxpayers, and more people to cheer when Augustus threw expensive games. And so came a series of laws designed to regulate Romans' love lives. First up, the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, 18 BCE. This law targeted Rome's upper classes, the senators and equestrians, basically the people with the money and influence. It said, you must marry, and you must have children. Single? Too bad. Widowed? Remarry. Pronto? Divorcee? Don't get too comfortable. The law even imposed age restrictions. Women had to marry between 20 and 50, and men between 25 and 60. It was like a legally enforced dating window. Miss your chance, and you weren't just lonely, you were breaking the law. And then came the penalties for celibacy. If you stayed single, the state punished you where it really hurt, your wallet. Celibate men and women lost the right to inherit property or receive legacies, except from close family. Essentially, Augustus turned singlehood into a financial black hole. Imagine living in Rome, attending the reading of your wealthy uncle's will, only to be told, sorry, you didn't marry, so the money goes to your cousin who has 3 kids and a mortgage. On the flip side, the laws rewarded those who did marry and reproduce. Families with 3 or more children were granted privileges under the ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children. For men, this meant exemptions from certain public duties. For women, it could even free them from the guardianship of a male relative, giving them rare independence in Roman society. In short, kids weren't just family, they were legal bargaining chips. Forget baby fever, Romans had tax break fever. But Augustus wasn't done tinkering. He turned his gaze to adultery. In Rome's earlier days, adultery was treated as a private family issue, but under Augustus's new Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis, it became a full-blown public crime, and the punishment was severe. Women caught cheating could lose half their dowry and a third of their property, and they could even be exiled. Men weren't exactly off the hook either, but here's the twist. Adultery laws applied much more harshly to women than to men. A married woman sleeping around, criminal. A married man doing the same as long as it wasn't with another man's wife. Practically a Tuesday. The law even roped in family members. A father could legally kill his daughter and her lover if he caught them in the act under his roof. A husband couldn't go that far, but he was required to divorce an adulterous wife or risk being charged as a pimp for tolerating her behavior. Imagine Rome's version of Judge Judy, but instead of lawsuits over noisy neighbors, cases were about who got caught in bed with whom. And because Augustus loved irony, even his own family wasn't spared. His daughter Julia famously flouted the very laws her father had enacted. She was accused of numerous affairs, and Augustus, unable to ignore his own legislation, banished her to a remote island. That's right, Rome's emperor outlawed adultery, and then had to exile his daughter for breaking his law. Moral of the story: if you legislate love, don't expect your family dinners to be peaceful. All of this legal micromanaging shows just how invested Rome was in policing private life. Marriage wasn't just a personal choice, it was a civic duty. To the Romans, the family was the foundation of the state. A weak family structure meant fewer heirs, fewer soldiers, and fewer loyal citizens. So the government stepped in with laws that basically said, marry now, make babies, or else. Of course, not everyone played along. Some clever Romans found loopholes. Men would adopt adult heirs to get around inheritance penalties. Wealthy women sometimes remarried quickly, but arranged technical marriages with minimal obligations. And unsurprisingly, adultery didn't exactly vanish. It just became riskier. Nothing kills the mood like knowing exile is on the table if you're caught. For all its strictness, though, Augustus's grand experiment didn't exactly reshape Roman morals forever. Over time, the laws were bent, ignored, or quietly sidestepped. Romans may have bowed to emperors, but when it came to romance, many preferred following their hearts or at least their wallets. Still, the fact that the Roman state tried to control people's love lives at all is both fascinating and a little terrifying. Today, governments might encourage marriage with tax incentives or offer family leave policies. In Rome, if you stayed single too long, the law reached into your pocket and pulled the money right out. Single? The state wasn't just nosy about your dating life. They could financially punish you for swiping left. If you think modern diets are full of rules, don't eat carbs. Count your calories. Gluten is the enemy. Ancient Rome had its own food police. Only, instead of nutritionists, it was senators. And instead of don't eat after 8 p.m., the rules were more like, you may only spend this much on your dinner party, or else, yes. Rome was a land where lawmakers didn't just govern battles and taxes, they governed your dinner plate. The Romans loved food, but they loved controlling it even more. Enter the sumptuary laws, which dictated how much could be spent on banquets. These weren't casual suggestions, they were actual legal caps on the cost of entertaining. For example, one famous law, the Lex Fania of 1601 BCE, limited dinners to a modest 100 asses, a sum roughly equal to a few chickens and maybe some vegetables. On certain feast days you could splurge a little more, 200 asses, and if it was a particularly special occasion, the big number was 300 asses. Basically, Rome invented the first spending cap on eating out. Imagine being fined today for ordering too much sushi. But here's the thing. Romans were never great at following their own rules. The rich were masters at bending the law while still flaunting their wealth. One trick was claiming the ingredients were cheap, but the presentation was priceless. Sure, you might technically be serving cabbage, legal, but when it's carved into the shape of Julius Caesar and dusted with saffron, the point isn't nutrition, it's status. Another workaround was bribing officials to look the other way while you served flamingo tongues and stuffed dormice. Yes, those were actual delicacies. Rome had no shortage of bizarre menu items that left outsiders wondering if Romans were feasting or playing a culinary prank. Exotic foods in particular were a sticking point. Imports like peacock, ostrich, and rare fish became symbols of extravagance. Moralists like Cato the Elder railed against these luxuries, claiming they weakened the Roman spirit. According to him, Rome's strength came from simple porridge, not from nibbling on jellyfish. But did the elite listen? Of course not. The more outrageous the food, the more it showed you had money to burn. It was basically ancient Instagram flexing, but with roasted giraffe instead of avocado toast. And if you think the laws only applied to dinner parties, think again. Even funeral feasts came with regulations. Romans had a tradition of hosting large meals to honor the dead, but some families went overboard, turning funerals into week-long banquets. Eventually, laws stepped in to cap how much could be spent, to stop grieving from becoming a competitive eating event. Picture this: you're mourning Uncle Gaius, but also calculating how much of the funeral budget can be spent on oysters without getting fined. Of course, the irony is that these laws never really stopped extravagance, they just made it sneakier. Archaeological evidence from Roman villas reveals elaborate kitchens, massive storerooms, and dining rooms designed for lavish feasts. In Pompeii, frescoes even show diners reclining while slaves serve endless trays of food. Clearly, simple meals weren't exactly the norm. The obsession with regulating food tells us something deeper about Rome. Banquets weren't just meals, they were political theatre. Hosting a dinner was a way to show off wealth, gain allies, and climb the social ladder. If you gave your guests a sad bowl of lentils, you looked stingy, but if you served a stuffed peacock with its feathers reattached, you looked powerful. The laws were Rome's attempt to keep this competition under control. Think of it as the government trying to keep billionaires from buying golden cheeseburgers just to spite the rest of us. Yet, for all the rules, Roman dining culture thrived on excess. Feasts could last all night, with guests reclining on couches, listening to musicians, and drinking until the room spun. Vomiting mid-banquet wasn't just expected, it was sometimes encouraged, since it made room for more food. Luxury laws tried to tone this down, but it's hard to legislate moderation when everyone thinks gluttony is glamorous. Some emperors even weighed in personally. Julius Caesar once passed a law limiting how much silverware could be used at banquets, probably because senators were showing up with enough gold plates to start a bank. Augustus, meanwhile, cracked down on imported delicacies, framing it as a patriotic duty to eat local. He wanted Romans to stick to Italian products, not exotic birds from Africa. It was a bit like banning French champagne so everyone had to drink domestic wine. Noble in theory, unpopular in practice, and of course hypocrisy was rampant. The same elites who passed food restrictions were the first to break them. Cicero might rant about simplicity, but he still attended feasts that made buffets look modest. Petronius's Satyricon even satirized this culture, describing banquets where food was arranged in absurd shapes, like a giant dish representing the zodiac, with every course themed to a star sign. Yes, dinner could be an astrology lesson, complete with edible scorpions. In the end, Rome's weird food rules tell us more about their anxieties than their appetites. The laws weren't really about preventing overeating, they were about keeping society's show-offs in check. Banquets were stages where status was displayed, alliances were forged, and egos were fed alongside roasted pigs. And while the government tried to slap a price tag on indulgence, the wealthy just found new ways to turn dinner into a spectacle. So the next time you're at a buffet piling your plate high, remember, Rome basically invented the first all-you-can't-eat buffet. The only difference is, if you exceeded your limit, you didn't just feel sick, you could get fined by the state. The ancient Romans were obsessed with order, from roads to aqueducts, to their oddly specific rules about dinner parties. Everything had its place. Death, of course, was no exception. If you thought grieving was a personal matter, Rome would like to politely disagree. To them, funerals weren't just private tragedies, they were public spectacles that needed government regulation. And naturally, they made some rules that were downright bizarre. Let's start with the wailing. If you picture a Roman funeral, you might imagine solemn silence or hushed reverence. Nope, it was loud, very loud. In fact, families often hired professional mourners. Women trained to cry dramatically, beat their chests, and let out theatrical howls that could make an opera singer look subtle. The louder you cried, the more respect it supposedly showed the dead. Except, the government wasn't too fond of this crying Olympics. Roman lawmakers eventually capped how many hired mourners you could have. Why? Because it got out of hand. Imagine your neighbor dying and suddenly 20 women are screaming in the street like a horror movie marathon. The Senate decided that grief needed a volume control button. And this wasn't just about noise pollution. Excessive wailing was seen as both un-Roman and a little too Eastern for their taste. Stoicism was a big cultural value. Control your emotions. Stay dignified. Don't look like you're auditioning for Real Housewives of the Roman Forum. So if you showed up at Uncle Gaius's funeral with an army of professional criers, you risked being fined or at least laughed at by your neighbors for being too extra. Then there were the tombs. Romans loved showing off their wealth in life, but in death, they sometimes went overboard. Families competed with lavish monuments, mausoleums and decorated sarcophagi that screamed, "We were rich," in case you forgot. This caused a problem because the city quickly started running out of space. Laws were put in place to restrict excessive tomb building, especially within city limits. In fact, burial inside the city walls was flat out banned. The Romans believed corpses brought disease and bad omens, so if you died, congratulations, you were now legally evicted from Rome. The famous Appian Way, leading south out of the city, became lined with tombs and mausoleums, like a highway rest stop of eternal advertisements. Marcus the baker, remember him forever in marble, but the law wasn't only about where you were buried, it was also about how much it cost. The state cracked down on extravagant funerals, limiting the number of musicians, mourners, and even the scale of the feasts afterward. Yes, Romans threw funeral feasts, sometimes huge ones. Think of it as one last party at the deceased's expense, except when families started bankrupting themselves over feeding half the neighborhood with endless wine and roasted meat. The government had to intervene. Thus, laws were passed to limit just how big a dead man's dinner could be. Rome basically invented the first budget-friendly funeral package. Still, like any law, these rules were made to be broken, or at least creatively ignored. Wealthy families often found loopholes. If you couldn't build a massive tomb, you might secretly spend a fortune decorating the interior of a modest one. If you couldn't throw a lavish feast, you might distribute expensive gifts to mourners instead. The rich were basically the original experts in bending the rules but not breaking them. And of course there were the social rules of mourning. Women were expected to grieve publicly but not excessively. Too much sadness was considered a weakness, but too little might make people whisper. Men, on the other hand, were encouraged to be stoic, though powerful generals sometimes staged enormous funerals as PR campaigns. Julius Caesar famously gave extravagant games in honor of his father's funeral, basically turning grief into free entertainment for the masses. Nothing says "I miss you, Dad" like gladiator fights and wild beast hunts. The irony is that despite all these restrictions, Romans still managed to make funerals one of the noisiest, most public and strangest aspects of their society. The government could pass laws to control crying, tombs, and feasts, but they could never truly stop Romans from turning death into spectacle. After all, Rome was a city that loved drama, even in the afterlife. And that's the funny thing. While today you might get noise complaints for throwing a loud party, in Rome you could get in trouble for throwing a loud funeral. Imagine getting fined because your grandma's send-off was too enthusiastic, or being told that your tomb was a little too fabulous for government taste. In the end, Roman funeral regulations weren't just about keeping the peace, they were about maintaining Roman identity, disciplined, orderly, and dignified, even when dealing with the chaos of death. The result? A system where grief was policed almost as tightly as public festivals or dinner parties. The Romans might not have invented the phrase "rest in peace," but they certainly tried to legislate it. So the next time you think about ancient Rome, don't just picture gladiators or emperors. Picture a man in a toga, holding a scroll, telling a widow, "Sorry ma'am, you'll have to quiet down those professional criers." And by the way, No more than 2 pigs at the funeral feast, because in Rome, even sorrow came with fine print. For all their marble monuments, aqueducts, and mathematical genius, the Romans were not exactly the calm, rational people they sometimes get credit for. Rome had an entire legal framework that treated magic not as entertainment, but as a deadly threat to the stability of society. Forget a Hogwarts letter. If you were caught with a spell book in Rome, you were more likely to get a death sentence than a house placement. Let's start with a basic truth. Romans believed in magic. Not in a whimsical fairy tale sense, but as a terrifying reality lurking in their streets. To them, curses could kill, love potions could ruin reputations, and a few whispered words might sway the will of the gods themselves. So naturally, lawmakers had to step in. After all, you can't have citizens summoning Jupiter to smite their neighbor because they didn't return a borrowed amphora. The earliest Roman laws lumped magic together with poisoning, a telling connection. If someone mysteriously died and no physical poison was found, the next suspect was maleficium, or harmful magic. This legal association was no accident. Romans saw both poison and sorcery as secretive, underhanded weapons of murder. And while a poisoner could be caught red-handed with a vial, proving sorcery was murkier. Sometimes as simple as being found with suspicious figurines, herbs, or wax dolls stabbed with needles. If you're thinking that sounds like voodoo, you're right. Romans were horrified by the idea that someone might bury a cursed tablet under your doorstep, leaving your luck and possibly your lifespan spiraling downward. One particularly infamous law was the Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Veneficiis, Cornelian law on assassins and sorcerers, established in 81 BCE. This wasn't just about your average knife-wielding thug. It specifically targeted people who used poisons and magic to harm others. Under this law, convicted sorcerers could face exile, confiscation of property, or even execution. So next time you're tempted to complain about strict HOA regulations in your neighborhood, remember that Romans had it worse. At least your HOA won't kill you for leaving out suspicious herbs. Probably. But magic wasn't only criminal when used to harm. The Romans even worried about harmless love spells. Imagine a lonely Roman man buying a potion from a street witch, hoping to win the affection of his crush. Cute, right? Wrong. Love magic was treated as coercion, essentially a supernatural form of kidnapping. Roman lawmakers figured, if you can trick someone into falling in love, you're bypassing their free will, and that was unacceptable. So, in an ironic twist, the Romans outlawed romance spells to protect your right to reject someone in peace. Of course, while the state outlawed magic, that didn't mean Romans stopped practicing it. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of cursed tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with requests to the gods or spirits, often folded up and nailed into tombs, wells, or even the walls of arenas. They read like angry Yelp reviews from the underworld. Spirits of the dead, please make Marcus lose his lawsuit against me, or bind the hands and tongue of the charioteer so he crashes and burns. Some were laughably petty, targeting cheating lovers or bad neighbors, but others were downright chilling, calling on deities of the underworld to torture enemies until death. Officially illegal? Yes. Common practice? Absolutely. It seems Romans were perfectly happy breaking the law if it meant ruining a rival's day. The emperors themselves got involved in cracking down on sorcery. Augustus, Rome's golden boy reformer, was notoriously strict about it. He had astrologers expelled from Rome, worried that horoscopes predicting the emperor's death could inspire rebellion. Tiberius, his successor, wasn't any friendlier to the occult. He executed people for dabbling in magic and had books on forbidden spells publicly burned. The message was clear. Fortune-telling wasn't just party entertainment, it was treason. If you guessed the emperor was doomed, you might just ensure your own doom instead. And let's not forget the everyday paranoia. Romans could accuse one another of witchcraft to settle grudges. A sudden illness? Must have been a spell. A failed business deal? Clearly cursed. Even if you were innocent, suspicion alone could wreck your life. Being labeled a magus sorcerer carried the same social stigma as being a criminal. You could be exiled, stripped of property, or worse, without much evidence. Basically, it was the ancient version of cancel culture, only this time the cancellation could end in execution. There's also the double standard. Official state religion had its share of ritual sacrifices, prayers and divinations. Priests slit open animals to read their entrails for omens, augurs watched bird flight patterns to predict the gods' will, and soothsayers made fortunes in the marketplace. These practices were perfectly legal because they were sanctioned by the state. But if a private citizen did the same thing without permission, witchcraft, illegal, punishable. In short, if you want to sacrifice a chicken to predict the future, you'd better have the government's stamp of approval. So, what does all this tell us? That Romans lived in a world where the invisible was just as dangerous as the visible. They believed laws could control not just people's actions but unseen forces. And while we might laugh today at the idea of prosecuting someone for a love potion, the Roman state saw it as a matter of life and death, order and chaos. Funny angle? Imagine the Roman police knocking on your door. "Excuse us, citizen, but we have reason to believe you whispered a spell over your neighbor's olive tree. Please come with us." Being a Roman citizen wasn't just a matter of birthplace. It was like having a VIP pass to the empire's best perks, free legal protections, the right to vote, well, at least if you were male and wealthy enough, the ability to run for office, and that smug sense of superiority over everyone else. Citizenship was the ultimate flex, but Rome didn't hand it out to just anyone. If you wanted in, you had to pass the empire's strict eligibility test. Think less welcome package and more exclusive members-only club, where the bouncer carried a gladius and didn't take bribes. Citizenship was originally the prized possession of Rome itself, a little badge of honor for people lucky enough to be born within the city or its immediate territories. As Rome expanded, it got trickier. Suddenly you had millions of conquered people wondering, so do we get to be Romans too, or are we just here for the taxes and gladiator shows? The answer depended heavily on politics, social class, and whether you happened to have annoyed the wrong senator. One of the great contradictions of Rome was that they loved to boast about their inclusivity, but their membership rules were tighter than an overstuffed toga. Certain professions, for example, were specifically barred from ever gaining citizenship. Actors were considered too scandalous. Yes, the same people adored in the theatre couldn't be trusted with the dignity of Roman politics. Gladiators, too, were automatically disqualified. Apparently, risking your life to entertain the masses was heroic enough for cheers, but not honorable enough for a voting ballot. And don't even ask about prostitutes. Roman lawmakers had no intention of elevating anyone who might undermine their carefully constructed moral superiority. Slaves, however, complicated things. Rome was built on their backs, and manumission, the practice of freeing slaves, was surprisingly common. Freedmen could climb their way into society. But there was a catch. Former slaves could never hold high political office, and their children carried the stain of servile origins for generations. It was like the empire saying, "Congratulations, you're free. But also, don't get too comfortable, we still remember where you came from." For Rome, controlling who could claim the title citizen wasn't just about pride, it was about power. Citizens were shielded from some of the nastier punishments. Crucifixion, for example, was strictly off-limits if you had Roman citizenship. You might still be executed, but at least it would be quick and relatively painless. To the Romans, this wasn't hypocrisy. It was hierarchy. The empire needed visible reminders that being Roman was better than being anything else. This sense of superiority even extended to provincial elites. Rome dangled citizenship like bait. Behave loyally, supply some troops, pay your taxes on time, and maybe your city would get an upgrade in status. In fact, the promise of eventual citizenship became one of Rome's most effective strategies for keeping its sprawling empire under control. People didn't necessarily want to rebel when there was always the tantalizing possibility of joining the inner circle. Of course, there were shortcuts for the ambitious and wealthy. During certain periods, you could buy citizenship outright. Imagine paying your way into Roman identity like a luxury brand membership. It wasn't cheap, but for those who could afford it, the payoff was huge. Suddenly doors opened, legal protections, access to political life, and most importantly, the chance to distance yourself from the plebs. Rome may have hated corruption in theory, but when cash was on the table, they were remarkably flexible. Still, being a citizen wasn't all wine and roses. It came with obligations too. Taxes were lighter than those for non-citizens, but citizens were expected to provide military service. That meant your shiny new Roman passport might also come with a side order of mandatory legion duty, complete with endless marching, blistering armor, and the very real possibility of getting skewered by a barbarian spear. Exclusivity always has its price tag. As centuries passed, citizenship slowly expanded. By 2112 CE, Emperor Caracalla made the dramatic move of granting citizenship to almost every free person in the empire. Historians debate whether this was an act of generosity or just a clever way to increase the tax base. Either way, the once exclusive club became a lot less special. What had once been a hard-won prize now became almost universal, and the Romans themselves occasionally complained that the brand was being diluted. Imagine a modern elite country suddenly handing out passports to everyone on the planet. The prestige drops, even if the practical benefits remain. And that's really the heart of Rome's citizenship rules: prestige. It wasn't just a legal status, it was a social statement. To be Roman was to stand above the conquered masses, to wear the label of civilized, to access rights denied to the majority of the empire's population. At the same time, it was a constant reminder of who didn't belong: the actors, the gladiators, the freed slaves still branded by their past. All were kept at arm's length, because Roman identity was too valuable to risk contamination. The irony: Rome built its culture, its economy, and even its entertainment industry on the backs of the very people it excluded. Without gladiators, there'd be no Colosseum spectacles. Without slaves, no palatial villas. Without provincial elites, no empire to boast about. Yet citizenship rules remained stubbornly restrictive until the very end, because Roman society thrived on distinction. So the next time you think of Rome as an open cosmopolitan empire, remember this: it was less melting pot and more private members' lounge. And unless you had the right birth, the right job, or the right bank account, you'd be stuck outside the velvet rope, staring in at the people sipping Falernian wine. Rome's version of an exclusive club, except the bouncer wasn't checking IDs. He had a sword. The Romans had a knack for turning everyday human relationships into state-sanctioned contracts. If you thought your family meddled too much in your personal affairs, imagine being born in Rome, where dad knows best wasn't just advice. It was written into law. The Roman legal system didn't just regulate your taxes, property, and toga etiquette. It had plenty to say about your dowry, your inheritance, and even how much control your father had over your very existence. Spoiler: a lot. Let's start with marriage. Not the romantic part, but the financial paperwork stapled to it. The dowry. In Rome, marriage was less about roses and more about ledgers. The bride's family was expected to provide a dowry: property, money, or land to help support the new household. Think of it as an ancient prenup, except it didn't prevent conflict, it often caused it. Dowries could be reclaimed if the marriage ended, for instance, through divorce. But there were detailed laws about how much had to be returned and when. If a husband mistreated his wife, he might be required to give the dowry back in full, which gave women some leverage in bad marriages. But on the flip side, if the wife was found guilty of misconduct, say adultery, kiss that dowry goodbye. It became his property permanently, like a consolation prize for public embarrassment. The state saw dowries as vital because they helped ensure financial stability in marriages, and therefore in society. For the Romans, love was optional, but a well-managed estate, that was eternal. Marriage wasn't the only relationship under scrutiny. Inheritance laws in Rome were notoriously complex, and they reveal just how nosy the state was about your family wealth. Roman law often dictated who you must leave money to, and spoiler, it was usually your children or closest male relatives. You couldn't just skip your kids and leave everything to your pet dog or your favorite gladiator. And yes, people tried. Under Augustus's social reforms, there were even laws penalizing bachelors and childless couples. If you didn't marry and produce legitimate children, you could be excluded from receiving inheritances altogether. Picture it. You've been the perfect uncle for decades, slipping coins into your nieces' and nephews' hands, only for the state to say, "Sorry, you should have tied the knot. No gold for you." Inheritance wasn't just about family squabbles, it was a tool of social engineering. Rome wanted strong family units and legitimate heirs to keep the citizen population thriving, and the law was there to make sure people didn't duck their responsibilities. Now, on to women's rights, or rather the Roman legal system's allergic reaction to them. Women in Rome could inherit wealth, property and land, but there was a catch. They weren't always allowed to manage it themselves. Instead, they were often placed under guardianship, tutela mulierum, meaning a male relative, father, brother, uncle, or sometimes even a non-relative appointed by the courts, had to approve their financial decisions. This meant that a wealthy widow might own multiple estates but still have to ask her cousin's permission to sell a donkey. It was, in effect, financial training wheels that never came off. There were some loopholes. Elite women who bore multiple children could sometimes be freed from guardianship under Augustus's laws. But for most Roman women, financial independence was less a right and more a rumor. So while Roman women could technically be landowners, their male guardians were the ones signing the dotted line. Imagine trying to invest in olive oil futures only to have your uncle veto it because he thought wine was a safer bet. Of all Roman family laws, nothing loomed larger than patria potestas, the power of the father. This wasn't just symbolic authority. The Roman father had legal power over his children regardless of their age. Yes, even if you were 40 years old with kids of your own, your dad could in theory still control your finances and make binding decisions for you. In the earliest days of Rome, the father's power extended to life and death. He could expose unwanted infants, sell his children into slavery, or even execute them if he felt the circumstances demanded it. By the late Republic and early Empire, these extreme measures were frowned upon, but the principle remained. Dad was in charge, legally and socially. Even property was technically the father's until he died. Sons could manage land, businesses and wealth, but on paper it all belonged to the patriarch. So if you invented a brilliant business selling amphorae, congratulations, it was actually your father's company until he passed away. Put together, these rules created a society where nearly every personal relationship was entangled with law. You couldn't just get married. It required financial contracts and dowry negotiations. You couldn't just inherit wealth. It depended on whether you had kids or obeyed Augustus's moral code. You couldn't just be a wealthy woman. You needed a male chaperone to co-sign your economic decisions. And you couldn't just grow old and independent. Your father's shadow loomed over you for life. Rome might have conquered the world, but at home, the real battles were fought over who signed the will, who controlled the dowry chest, and who had the authority to sell the family cow. Rome, where Dad's approval rating wasn't just important, it was legally binding. When people think of Roman entertainment, they usually imagine blood-drenched gladiators, roaring lions, or over-the-top spectacles in the Colosseum. What they don't usually imagine is bureaucracy. Yet, leave it to Rome to take even fun and say, yes, but what if we regulated it within an inch of its life? Because for Romans, games weren't just entertainment, they were a reflection of social order, and naturally the law stepped in to make sure everyone knew their place while they cheered on someone else's bad day. One of the most striking examples was the concept of infamia. No, not a cool gladiator nickname. It was more like a legal scarlet letter. Gladiators, actors, prostitutes, and a few other unsavory professions carried this status. It didn't matter if you were the crowd's favorite or if your name was shouted from the cheap seats every Saturday. Legally, you were an outcast. Infames lost certain rights, like testifying in court or holding public office. Imagine the absurdity. You could fight off a charging elephant with a trident in front of 50,000 fans, but you couldn't sign a business contract. It's like being an international sports celebrity today, but legally classified the same as a parking ticket. The ruling elite took this one step further by forbidding senators from dirtying their reputations with low-class professions. No acting, no gladiator stunts, no singing in the chorus of a bawdy play. Senators were meant to project dignity, which in Roman terms meant sitting still and looking stern while other people had fun. It wasn't about moral squeamishness so much as maintaining class distinctions. Rome was built on hierarchy, and nothing says stay in your lane like legally banning politicians from chasing lions around an arena. Although considering the quality of Roman politics, maybe the lions would have done the city a favor. But the laws didn't stop at who could perform. They extended to who could watch. Roman theaters and arenas had seating arranged like a rigid social diagram. Senators got the front row. Knights sat just behind. Plebeians took the middle and upper tiers, and women were often shoved to the worst seats in the house, farthest from the action. Even slaves and the poor were given separate sections, tucked away so no one could mistake them for respectable citizens. It wasn't so much a viewing experience as a reminder of where you ranked on Rome's giant social ladder. If you sat down at the wrong spot, it wasn't just a faux pas, it could actually get you into trouble. Of course, all this orderliness was really about appearances. The elites wanted to be seen as above the chaos, even as they sponsored the very bloodbaths that kept the mob entertained. The irony was that the mob didn't really care about legal categories when the games began. Once the lions were let loose, it's hard to imagine anyone shouting, "Excuse me, is that actor allowed to be in the arena?" Still, Rome's lawmakers believed control extended even to leisure. Spectacle had to be grand, yes, but also respectable. Or at least respectable for those who could afford front-row cushions. It's worth noting that laws around entertainment reveal how Romans thought of performance as more than just distraction. It was political theatre, a way to showcase Roman dominance, civic unity, and the generosity of the elite. Regulations around who could sponsor games, who could appear, and who could sit where were all tools of propaganda. The message was simple. Rome wasn't just conquering the world, it was conquering how you had fun. The funny part is how familiar it feels. Today we talk about VIP seating at concerts, luxury boxes at sports stadiums, or front-row tickets at Broadway shows. The Romans were already there, centuries earlier, sorting people into sections and charging status instead of money. The difference, of course, is that in Rome you couldn't just splurge for a better view, you had to actually be born into the right family. No amount of extra denarii could move you closer to the action if your toga stripes weren't thick enough. So while the roar of the crowd and clash of gladiators might seem like unrestrained chaos, it was actually heavily curated chaos, one that reminded everyone that in Rome even leisure had legal limits. You could cheer, you could jeer, you could gamble on your favorite fighter, but you'd better do it from the seat assigned to your class. Rome invented bread and circuses. Yes, but they also invented assigned seating that doubled as a social lesson. If there was one thing the Romans loved more than conquest, aqueducts and a good toga party, it was writing laws that tried to tell people how to behave. You'd think a civilization built on war, trade and empire would just let people live their lives, but no. Rome believed morality could and should be legislated, which meant the state spent centuries trying to police its citizens' private habits. Picture the world's most judgmental mom, except instead of wagging a finger, she had an army. Luxury, for example, was a constant target of Roman lawmakers. Sumptuary laws restricted how much people could spend on clothes, feasts, and jewelry. Senators and emperors often fretted that Rome was getting soft because too many citizens were wasting fortunes on silk imported from China, pearls from the Red Sea, and banquets that looked like edible art projects. The official narrative was that luxury corrupted morals. The unofficial reality was that the elite wanted to keep their status symbols exclusive. If everyone wore gold-threaded tunics, how could the senators stand out at the forum? Laws were passed limiting who could wear certain fabrics, how many guests you could invite to dinner, and even how much you could spend on wedding celebrations. The funny part? People ignored these laws constantly. If anything, enforcing them probably kept Roman bureaucrats very busy spying on dinner menus. Then there was gambling. Romans loved dice games the way modern fans love sports betting. The problem? Gambling was technically illegal, except during the festival of Saturnalia, when rules were relaxed and chaos reigned. That didn't stop people from rolling dice behind closed doors, and sometimes even emperors joined in. Augustus, who famously posed as a moral reformer, was said to gamble for fun at night. Essentially, the same people writing laws against dice were sneaking a few throws after work. If you wanted to see hypocrisy in action, ancient Rome had you covered. Religion also wasn't left alone by lawmakers. The Roman state expected its citizens to sacrifice to the gods, and not doing so wasn't just bad manners, it was illegal. Refusing to sacrifice was seen as undermining the gods' protection of the empire, which is one reason early Christians were persecuted. To Roman officials, failing to toss incense on the altar was less about personal belief and more like refusing to pay your spiritual taxes. Even private behavior had a public consequence in Rome's eyes. If you didn't pray properly, you might doom everyone. It was the ancient equivalent of someone blaming the whole team's loss on your bad luck socks. Of course, no survey of Roman morality laws would be complete without the emperors themselves, who often added their own bizarre rules. Caligula, for example, supposedly banned people from mentioning goats around him because he was insecure about his hairy legs and goat-like appearance. That's right, Rome once lived under a ruler who weaponized insecurity into legislation. Other emperors had their own quirks. Domitian outlawed castration, which was partly practical but also tied to his obsession with restoring traditional values. In short, morality laws could shift depending on the emperor's mood swings, which made them both terrifying and hilarious. The real irony of these laws is how unenforceable most of them were. You can't exactly stop a rich Roman from sneaking oysters into a party, or keep gamblers from rattling dice in back alleys. And while the emperors wanted Rome to project an image of stern discipline, the reality was a messy empire full of contradictions. They legislated morality not because it worked, but because it gave the appearance of order. Rome was basically saying, "We're in control of your lifestyle," even while the average citizen found clever ways to bend or ignore the rules. And yet, these laws shaped daily life in ways we still feel today. Modern governments continue to debate bans on gambling, restrictions on luxury imports, and rules about public morality. Ancient Rome shows us that the urge to regulate human behavior isn't new. It's been around for thousands of years. Whether it was limiting feasts, banning dice, or telling you which gods to honor, Rome wanted to make sure you weren't just a good citizen, but a morally upright one. The only problem was that Rome's version of upright depended entirely on who was in charge that week. So in the end, Rome's obsession with controlling morality wasn't really about ethics at all. It was about power, appearances, and keeping society in check. And while modern audiences can laugh at Caligula's goat ban or the endless sumptuary laws, the truth is, Rome's moral micromanaging looks suspiciously familiar. After all, every time a government tells you what you can't eat, drink, or do on weekends, just remember the Romans tried it first and it didn't really work. If you think chickens are harmless farmyard critters, beloved mainly for their eggs and their occasional ability to ruin your sleep at dawn, then congratulations, you're living in the 21st century. Because in the Middle Ages, people looked at a rooster and thought, yes, but what if it breathed fire and murdered me with eye contact? And thus the cockatrice was born. Part chicken, part dragon, all nightmare fuel. So what exactly is a cockatrice? Imagine taking a rooster, bright red comb, proud strut, and an ego far larger than its body, and deciding that wasn't nearly terrifying enough. Now graft onto it leathery dragon wings, a lashing serpent tail, and eyes that could supposedly kill a man faster than spoiled medieval ale. What you end up with is something that looks like it escaped from the reject pile of a fantasy role-playing manual. To medieval villagers, though, this creature was not a silly doodle. It was a legitimate threat, lurking just one barnyard accident away. The origins of this bizarre hybrid are even stranger. According to legend, the cockatrice came from a highly unusual egg, not the sort you fry up for breakfast, but one laid by a rooster. Yes, you heard that right, an egg laid by a male chicken. Already we're off to a biologically questionable start. But wait, it gets better. This impossible egg then had to be hatched not by a hen, but by a toad or a serpent. Apparently, in medieval monster making, the more absurd the breeding process, the more powerful the result. The rooster egg was like the ultimate dark spell ingredient, weird, rare, and best handled with gloves. Now, before you laugh too hard, let's remember, in a world without biology textbooks, a rooster laying an egg wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. People in the Middle Ages didn't exactly have a firm grasp on animal reproduction. If a hen could lay eggs, why not a rooster under special circumstances? After all, these were the same people who thought spontaneous generation was real, flies from rotting meat, mice from old grain, and sure, a chicken dragon from a bachelor rooster with ambition. But here's the kicker. This bizarre idea actually made sense to them. The rooster already carried symbolic weight in medieval thought. It was both admired and distrusted. On the one hand, it was the herald of dawn, associated with vigilance and even Christ himself in some Christian traditions. On the other, it had a sneaky, aggressive personality, and its constant crowing could easily be rebranded as ominous rather than cheerful. If you're already half convinced that a rooster is a feathered villain in waiting, then imagining it laying a cursed egg isn't too far of a stretch. Add a toad or serpent into the mix. Two animals dripping with medieval associations of poison and sin, and suddenly you've got a recipe for supernatural poultry of death. And why stop at a simple monster? The Middle Ages had a habit of blending animals to create hybrids that embodied fears and moral lessons. The griffin mixed the lion and eagle to symbolize strength and watchfulness. The mermaid blended human and fish to warn sailors of temptation and doom. So why not fuse the barnyard rooster with a serpent and dragon? The result was a creature that straddled the familiar and the terrifying. It had the everyday presence of a rooster, something everyone knew, but twisted into something monstrous. That blend of ordinary and impossible is exactly what made the cockatrice stick in people's imaginations. Think of it this way. In an age when most people never traveled more than a few miles from their village, knowledge of exotic animals was fuzzy at best. Lions, crocodiles, elephants, these were creatures most Europeans only knew through hearsay, travelers' tales, or heavily stylized illustrations in bestiaries. If you've only ever seen a badly drawn picture of a crocodile that looks suspiciously like a lizard with dental problems, then being told that a chicken-dragon hybrid lurked somewhere in the world wasn't that hard to swallow. For the medieval imagination, the cockatrice filled a gap. The barnyard and the dragon's lair finally had a horrifying love child. But the cockatrice wasn't just an oops, biology went wrong story. It was a symbol. In a deeply religious culture, unnatural births and strange hybrids were often interpreted as signs of sin, divine punishment, or the world being out of order. The idea of a rooster laying an egg was unsettling precisely because it broke the natural order. Nature, to medieval minds, was supposed to be stable and purposeful. When it wasn't, it meant danger. That danger, personified, was the cockatrice. So the cockatrice entered medieval lore, not just as a random monster, but as a reminder that the world was full of mystery, danger, and divine warnings. This wasn't just a creature you avoided in a dark alley. It was a feathered sermon on the dangers of straying from God's plan. And in that sense, it wasn't just nightmare fuel, it was moral instruction wrapped in scaly wings and a beak. Of course, modern science would dismiss the cockatrice as medieval nonsense, but before you judge too harshly, remember that these were people who lived in a world where medicine was leeches, disease had no explanation, and thunderstorms were often blamed on witchcraft. Believing in a death chicken might have actually been one of their more reasonable fears. And that, dear listener, is how the humble rooster got promoted from noisy farm pest to the most dangerous creature never to exist. If the cockatrice sounds suspiciously like something a medieval tavern bard made up after one too many ales, you're half right. But the truth is, the Middle Ages rarely invented monsters from scratch. Instead, they were expert recyclers. Think of them as history's greatest upcyclers of nonsense. Take an old Greek myth, add a dash of Roman science, stir it in with local superstition, and voila, you've got yourself a brand new monster. The cockatrice is less an original creation and more a terrifying hand-me-down sweater, patched, repurposed, and still uncomfortable to wear. At the heart of its ancestry is the Greek basilisk. Long before the cockatrice strutted onto the medieval stage, the basilisk was slithering around ancient imagination. According to the Greek writer Pliny the Elder, who documented everything from ants the size of dogs to medicinal properties of crushed snails, the basilisk was a serpent born in the deserts of North Africa. This wasn't your ordinary snake. The basilisk was said to kill with a glance, scorch the earth with its breath, and leave trails of death wherever it slithered. Basically, it was a reptile with the powers of a nuclear meltdown. Romans inherited this story and ran with it. For them, the basilisk was the king of serpents, which is ironic because it was reportedly only about a foot long. Imagine the deadliest creature on earth being roughly the size of a Subway sandwich, yet its lethal stare made it infinitely more terrifying than lions or bears. At least you could fight those with a spear. The basilisk? Forget it. If you looked at it, you were toast. It was the perfect myth for people who wanted their monsters dangerous but not logistically messy. Fast forward a few centuries to medieval Europe, where scribes and scholars devoured classical texts like a modern-day reader scrolling conspiracy forums. They took these Greco-Roman accounts and decided to remix them. But instead of keeping the basilisk as a boring snake, medieval writers thought, what if we upgraded this thing? Gave it some wings? Maybe a beak? Spice it up with barnyard flair? And thus the cockatrice was born. A mythological rebrand so bold it could have had its own marketing campaign. Here's where the cockatrice gets interesting. While the basilisk was firmly reptilian, the cockatrice blurred boundaries. It was part serpent, part dragon, and most shockingly part chicken. Why the poultry upgrade? Chickens were deeply symbolic in medieval thought, as we saw in Chapter 1, but this fusion also made the monster more relatable. Everyone knew what a rooster looked like. Few had seen a lion or crocodile. By blending the familiar with the fantastic, the cockatrice felt more plausible. It was like localizing a foreign product. Take the exotic basilisk and give it a homegrown twist. But the Middle Ages didn't stop at recycling myths. They tied them into their favorite obsession, natural philosophy and alchemy. To them, monsters weren't just fairy tales. They were potential evidence of how the universe worked. If nature was God's grand book, then oddities like a chicken-dragon hybrid were footnotes waiting to be interpreted. Medieval scholars weren't content to say this monster doesn't exist. Instead, they asked, what does it mean? Take alchemists, for example. These were the ultimate experimental dreamers of the age, always poking around with sulfur, mercury, and occasionally exploding their labs. To them, the cockatrice wasn't just a creepy legend. It was a potential metaphor for transformation. The rooster laying an egg, a reversal of nature, and the toad hatching it, an inversion of roles fit neatly into alchemical thinking, where opposites and contradictions produce strange results. The cockatrice symbolized corruption, inversion, and unnatural change, themes alchemists obsessed over while trying to turn lead into gold. Meanwhile, theologians happily latched onto the cockatrice's moral allegory. To them it represented sin itself, small, seemingly harmless at first, but deadly when allowed to grow. Much like the basilisk, the cockatrice's lethal gaze symbolized the idea that even looking at sin could destroy you. The rooster connection gave it extra punch. It was a familiar animal twisted into something dangerous, a perfect sermon illustration for priests eager to keep peasants in line. If all this sounds convoluted, that's because it was. But remember, medieval Europe had a habit of blending theology, folklore, and pseudoscience into one big pot. Monsters weren't just entertainment, they were moral lessons, medical metaphors, and cosmic riddles. In this way, the cockatrice became a bridge between the ancient basilisk and medieval anxieties about order, sin, and the mysteries of nature. The funny part? Every culture swore the cockatrice lived somewhere else. Greeks thought it was in North Africa, Romans said it haunted Libya. Medieval Europeans were convinced it lurked far away in some dangerous land, or possibly just in the next county over. This geographic vagueness was perfect for myth-making. After all, it's much easier to fear a monster when it's always just out of reach rather than in your own chicken coop. So to summarize, the cockatrice was basically a mythological rebrand job. The basilisk slithered out of Greece. Roman naturalists dressed it up with terrifying details, and medieval Europe threw in some barnyard chic. The result was a creature that checked all the boxes, frightening, symbolic, and absurdly specific in how it was supposedly born. Or to put it another way, the Middle Ages didn't invent the cockatrice, they just rebranded it like a medieval Apple product. New paint, same ridiculous concept. When it comes to medieval monsters, the cockatrice didn't just look ridiculous, it came with a moveset straight out of a nightmare. Forget claws or fire breathing like your average dragon. No, the cockatrice was more efficient. It could kill you by simply existing in the same space. Its arsenal included 3 terrifying abilities: a lethal stare, poisonous breath, and a death touch that made shaking hands with it a career-ending mistake. If the cockatrice were a video game boss, it wouldn't even need to attack. You'd just spawn into the arena, look at it, and drop dead. The cockatrice's most famous weapon was its killer glance. Medieval bestiaries describe it as a creature that could slay man or beast with nothing more than eye contact. No dramatic roar, no swooping dive from the sky, just a glare so toxic it could outmatch the angriest mother-in-law. To the medieval imagination, this made perfect sense. Eyes were thought to emit invisible rays, a kind of mystical laser vision. Philosophers from antiquity, like Euclid, believed sight worked by the eyes projecting beams outward. If that's how normal eyes worked, then a cockatrice's gaze was simply a weaponized upgrade. One moment you're admiring the paltry dragon hybrid, the next your fertilizer. Then there was its breath. Unlike the dragon's fiery exhale, the cockatrice specialized in poison gas. Supposedly, even the air around it was deadly. Plants withered, wells became toxic, birds fell from the sky mid-flight. The cockatrice didn't need to chase you down, it just had to breathe in your general direction. Think of it as a medieval version of chemical warfare, but cheaper and conveniently available in your nearest cursed barnyard. Now to modern ears, death by stink sounds silly, but for medieval people, it was frighteningly believable. Remember, this was an era when bad smells were often blamed for spreading disease. The miasma theory, the belief that illness came from noxious air, was medical gospel. Plague outbreaks, rotten smells, fevers, foul vapors. If you caught a disease, people assumed you'd inhaled something nasty. So when they heard that the cockatrice's breath could kill, it fit neatly into their worldview. After all, their daily lives were already filled with death by stink, unwashed bodies, chamber pots in the street, and food that was one questionable hour away from poisoning you. The cockatrice just elevated that reality into the supernatural. And if glare and breath weren't enough, the cockatrice also supposedly had a deadly touch. One accidental brush against its scales, and you were done for. Medieval storytellers claimed it could kill snakes, birds, and even large animals with a single strike. Farmers whispered that if it wandered into your village, livestock would drop dead overnight. It was like a feathery grim reaper with wings. This made the cockatrice the ultimate embodiment of "don't touch that, it looks gross." Except in this case they meant it literally. What's fascinating is how the cockatrice's abilities compare with other legendary killers of the past. Take the Gorgon Medusa from Greek mythology, who turned men to stone with her gaze. Same eye-based weapon, different style points. The cockatrice skipped the whole statue garden aesthetic and went straight for instant death. Or consider dragons, who belched fire but required a direct line of attack. A cockatrice didn't need fire or claws, it weaponized passivity. Even snakes, with their venomous bite, seemed slow and outdated compared to a creature that could kill you without moving a muscle. To medieval thinkers, the cockatrice's combination of powers made it the perfect monster of fear. Why? Because you couldn't really fight it. Knights with swords, useless. Archers, pointless if you died the second you looked at your target. Poison-resistant weasels might stand a chance, as we'll get to in a later chapter, but for the average peasant, survival strategies boiled down to don't be in the same postcode. It's hard to overstate how psychologically terrifying that would have been. And let's not forget the symbolic dimension. To theologians, each of these powers carried moral weight. The deadly glance represented the dangers of temptation. You didn't even have to act on sin, just looking could destroy you. The poisonous breath symbolized corruption spreading through communities, like gossip or heresy. The death touch was sin's direct consequence. One brush, and you're gone. The cockatrice wasn't just a monster, it was a sermon wrapped in feathers and scales. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some skeptics of the time pointed out the logistical issues. If a cockatrice killed everything it looked at, wouldn't it just wipe out its own food supply? Did it walk around starving, glaring at empty fields? And how did it survive its own breath? These logical gaps didn't stop the legend, though. Medieval minds weren't focused on zoological consistency. They were focused on awe, fear, and symbolism, and in that department, the cockatrice delivered. If you're thinking this all sounds absurd, remember, the Middle Ages were already full of everyday hazards that felt just as random and unfair. You could die from spoiled bread, a rusty nail, or a neighbor sneezing too close. A monster that could kill you with a glare was simply a mythical extension of reality. Or, as one might put it, forget swords or arrows. The cockatrice could kill you faster than your neighbor's garlic breath at Sunday Mass. To modernize, the rooster is just an overconfident alarm clock with feathers, loud, territorial, and guaranteed to ruin your sleep if you live within a 5-mile radius. But to medieval people, roosters were far more than barnyard nuisances. They were charged with symbolism, suspicion, and a healthy dose of fear. In a world where animals were constantly interpreted as signs from God or the devil, the rooster became both sacred herald and shady troublemaker. And when a rooster started getting too creative, say laying an egg, it became a cosmic red flag. First, let's deal with the positive side. Roosters weren't all bad in medieval eyes. In fact, they had one very important job, announcing dawn. Their crowing at sunrise made them living alarm bells, symbols of vigilance and light overcoming darkness. In Christian symbolism, this was powerful stuff. The rooster crowing at dawn could be seen as Christ triumphing over sin, or as the soul waking from the darkness of ignorance into the light of salvation. Churches even placed rooster-shaped weather vanes on top of steeples to remind congregations to be spiritually watchful. In this sense, the rooster was holy poultry, a feathered herald of divine order. But as with most things in the Middle Ages, the line between sacred and suspicious was razor thin. Because while the rooster was admired, it was also mistrusted. For one, it crowed not only at dawn, but sometimes at odd hours of the night. To medieval minds, this unpredictability was eerie. Why was it crowing at midnight? Was it sensing something supernatural? Was it keeping secret meetings with the devil? It didn't help that roosters were notoriously aggressive, pecking at anything that moved. Their strutting arrogance made them easy candidates for symbolic villainy. If the hen was seen as humble and domestic, the rooster was pride incarnate, walking sin with feathers. And then came the truly unsettling part. The idea of egg-laying roosters. Normally, hens lay eggs. Everyone knew that, but every so often, a strange, misshapen egg would appear in a hen house, and if no one saw which bird produced it, suspicion fell on the rooster. Medieval logic went like this. That egg looks weird. I didn't see a hen lay it. Must be the rooster. Case closed. And since roosters weren't supposed to lay eggs at all, this was considered a violation of nature's laws. In a world where the natural order was thought to reflect God's order, a rooster laying an egg was more than a curiosity. It was a cosmic horror. These so-called cock's eggs were treated with outright dread. People believed they could hatch monsters, the dreaded cockatrice being the prime example. Finding one of these eggs was like stumbling upon a live grenade in your chicken coop. The recommended course of action? Destroy it immediately. Some records even suggest burning them on the spot, just in case a serpent or toad wandered by and decided to hatch it. Imagine explaining that household core, honey, I'll be late for dinner. Found another demon egg under the haystack. Why this terror of the unnatural? To understand, we need to look at how medieval people viewed nature itself. For them, nature wasn't random or chaotic. It was orderly and purposeful, created by God with clear roles for everything. Animals behaved in predictable ways, because that's how divine design worked. When something broke the rules, like a rooster supposedly producing an egg, it was more than odd, it was wrong. It meant the world was slipping out of alignment. If nature was God's book, then a rooster egg was graffiti scrawled by the devil. This deep anxiety about unnatural behavior extended far beyond poultry. Calves born with two heads, lambs with deformities, even unusual weather patterns, all of these were interpreted as omens. A rooster laying an egg was part of this broader category of the unnatural in nature, and nothing unsettled medieval minds more than the idea that the devil could twist God's creation into monstrous parodies. In that sense, the rooster became a suspect not because it was inherently evil, but because it was perched right on the edge between natural order and supernatural threat. Roosters also carried layers of folklore baggage. In some traditions, their crowing was said to banish demons, driving away evil spirits at the first light of dawn, but paradoxically, other tales claimed the devil himself sometimes took the form of a rooster. That's right, the same bird that could chase away demons could also be the demon. Consistency was not the strong suit of medieval superstition. The result was that roosters lived a double life in the human imagination, both divine guard dogs and Satan's interns. The irony here is delicious. The animal we think of today as the most ordinary of farmyard creatures was, in the medieval mindset, a living contradiction, admired and despised, holy and unholy, comforting and suspicious. And when you add the possibility of a rooster egg birthing a chicken-dragon hybrid with death ray eyes, it's no wonder medieval people kept one foot in awe and the other in terror. So next time you hear a rooster crow, imagine being a medieval peasant trying to sleep. That sound could be a call to prayer, a reminder of Christ, or a herald of impending doom. No wonder villagers looked at the proud bird and muttered, "Yep, that's Satan's intern." So you've wandered into the wrong part of medieval Europe, and now you're face to face with a cockatrice, half chicken, half dragon, full nightmare fuel. What's the game plan? Running away is useless. Its glance alone could kill you. Calling the local knight might seem like a good idea, but knights were more used to fighting armored humans than poultry that could vaporize you with bad breath. Luckily for you, medieval thinkers had a grab bag of solutions to this bizarre problem. Spoiler, most of them sound less like military strategies and more like the ramblings of a sleep-deprived farmhand. First up, mirrors. One of the most popular solutions involved simply holding up a polished piece of metal and letting the cockatrice destroy itself with its own deadly stare. Yes, really. According to this logic, the cockatrice was essentially a medieval Medusa, a creature so vain or clueless that a single reflection could trigger instant self-destruction. This solution had the appealing benefit of not requiring you to actually swing a sword or get too close. Just polish up your shiny armor, channel your inner narcissist, and hope the chicken dragon didn't notice you trembling. Of course, this assumes you actually owned a mirror. For medieval peasants, reflective surfaces weren't exactly common. Your average villager couldn't just nip down to the market for a compact mirror. They'd be lucky to catch a glimpse of themselves in a puddle, which makes you wonder, how many brave souls marched into cockatrice territory, armed with nothing but a dented cooking pot and blind optimism. Now let's talk about the most bizarre anti-cockatrice weapon of all time, the humble weasel. Medieval bestiaries were filled with the claim that weasels were immune to the cockatrice's powers. Not only immune, they were its sworn enemies. If you unleashed a weasel on a cockatrice, the feisty little mammal would supposedly leap straight into battle and rip the monster apart. In other words, your survival depended on finding the angriest, most caffeinated weasel in town and letting it do the dirty work. Why a weasel? Because medieval people saw them as slippery, sneaky, and strangely magical. These creatures could squeeze into burrows, steal eggs, and generally wreak havoc. Perfect characteristics for a mythological pest control agent. Some texts even claimed that weasels had a natural antidote to poison, which made them the ideal counter to the cockatrice's toxic breath. Imagine the scene: a terrified peasant clutching a wriggling sack, muttering, "Don't fail me now, buddy," before unleashing ferret-shaped fury on a monster with wings. When it came to supernatural chickens, steel alone wasn't enough. You had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, superstition with superstition. Medieval thinkers leaned heavily on the idea that like cures like. The cockatrice was born from unnatural magic, a rooster's egg hatched by a toad or serpent, so of course only other magical solutions would work against it. A sword couldn't fix what the devil had clearly designed, but a well-placed spell, holy charm, or the proper animal might. This belief made perfect sense in the worldview of the time. Nature was seen as a delicate balance of humors, symbols, and divine laws. If something broke those laws, you needed something equally strange to put it right again. That's why so many remedies sound like something out of a magician's handbook rather than a farmer's guide. Killing the cockatrice wasn't about muscle, it was about matching weirdness with weirdness. The real question is, why did people actually buy into this? Surely someone at some point noticed that mirrors don't usually kill chickens, and weasels are more likely to steal your food than save your life. But belief in cockatrice cures wasn't about scientific experimentation. It was about having something to cling to in the face of fear. Imagine living in a world where strange diseases could wipe out your village overnight, where unexplained deaths were blamed on curses, and where nature itself seemed like a daily threat. A monster like the cockatrice fit neatly into that reality. And if you were told that carrying a shiny object or keeping a pet weasel could protect you, you'd probably believe it too. After all, it's not like you had a team of scientists on hand to run a randomized controlled trial. Looking back, it's hard not to chuckle. Your Majesty, the beast has been spotted. Quick, fetch me my weasel. The sheer absurdity makes you wonder how many medieval taverns hosted arguments over which method worked best. Nah, mate. My cousin's neighbor killed one with a mirror. Sliced itself in two, it did. Rubbish. Everyone knows you need at least 3 weasels or you're doomed. But beneath the comedy lies a truth. People weren't stupid. They were resourceful. They didn't have science, but they had stories. And those stories, however bizarre, gave them a way to fight back, at least in their minds, against a terrifying world filled with unknowns. So if you ever find yourself transported back to the Middle Ages and confronted by a cockatrice, remember your options: a mirror, if you've got one polished to a shine; a weasel, if you can keep it from biting you first; or, if all else fails, a prayer that your neighbors are just exaggerating and that the scary bird in front of you is in fact just a very confused rooster. The moral of the story: the medieval cockatrice defense plan proves that humans will always find a way to explain the unexplainable, and sometimes those explanations are equal parts genius and hilariously misguided. After all, why invent modern weaponry when you could simply outsource your monster problems to the neighborhood ferret? By the time the cockatrice strutted its scaly feathers into the limelight of medieval imagination, it had gone from whispered fireside story to full-blown celebrity. The creature wasn't lurking in dark corners anymore. It was front and center in bestiaries, illuminated manuscripts, sermons, and anything else that carried a whiff of authority. In an age where most people couldn't read, a single drawing of a chicken with dragon wings and a murderous stare was as convincing as breaking news. And when that drawing was framed with shimmering gold leaf, you didn't question it. You nodded solemnly and thought, "Ah yes, death by poultry, that checks out." The medieval bestiary was the cockatrice's stage, and it performed brilliantly. These books weren't just natural history guides. They were medieval PowerPoints blending strange zoology with heavy-handed moral lessons. Every beast, real or imagined, was roped into a sermon about sin, virtue, or why you should really stop stealing your neighbor's turnips. Lions represented Christ. Ants were tiny models of hard work. And then there was the cockatrice, a deadly mashup that screamed sin will kill you in the most absurd way possible. Think of it as an illustrated morality play, where every bizarre animal was less about biology and more about whether you were going to heaven or straight into a fiery pit. The cockatrice's role was simple: temptation in feathered disguise. Just as it looked like a harmless chicken until you noticed the fangs, sin was supposed to seem friendly before it ruined your life. The lesson worked beautifully in a time when everyday dangers already felt supernatural. Plagues, famines, and wars left people twitchy and ready to believe that chickens could double as executioners. Preachers, never ones to miss an opportunity, used the cockatrice as a feathery metaphor for evil. If you let sin into your heart, it would kill you just as surely as this half-reptile barnyard monstrosity. And with that, the congregation walked home nervously, eyeing every rooster along the road. The art made things worse or better, depending on how much you enjoyed medieval fear-mongering. Illuminators weren't scientists, they were artists with a flair for drama. If someone told them a cockatrice could kill with a look, they drew it glaring like a medieval laser beam. If its breath was deadly, they painted peasants keeling over in clouds of toxic fumes. These weren't just illustrations, they were horror comics disguised as holy truth. For the average medieval villager who probably never saw an actual lion, the drawings were gospel. If it appeared in a book decorated with flowers, saints, and tiny dragons chewing on vines in the margins, then surely it was as real as taxes and toothaches. What makes the cockatrice fascinating is how much its image spread beyond the books. Heraldry borrowed it as a symbol of menace, plastering it on shields and banners like a medieval warning sign. Towns spun their own cockatrice legends, claiming one had once lived in their well, their cave, or their neighbor's suspiciously creepy barn. This wasn't just an imaginary beast anymore, it was a local celebrity, the kind of creature that gave your town bragging rights. Rome has its Colosseum, Paris has Notre Dame. We have a chicken dragon that allegedly killed a shepherd 3 generations ago. In many ways, the cockatrice was a case study in medieval viral marketing. Information spread slowly, but it stuck once it reached you, and when the church or local nobility repeated the story, it gained weight. If priests preached about it, if books painted it, and if artists sketched it into stained glass, then it wasn't just a myth, it was practically an endorsed reality. You could say the cockatrice was fake news, but medieval style, illuminated, moralized, and absolutely believed. What's both funny and a little sobering is how easily a drawing could substitute for evidence. No one asked for proof because proof wasn't the point. The cockatrice wasn't real in the modern biological sense, but it was real in the cultural sense. It carried moral weight, inspired genuine fear, and wove itself into stories that shaped behavior. If a rooster looked at you funny, you didn't shrug it off. You crossed yourself and prayed you weren't about to become the next victim of poultry-related doom. And so, by the late Middle Ages, the cockatrice wasn't just a strange myth, it was part of the cultural wallpaper. Whether you met it in a manuscript, in a sermon, or in the colourful stories passed around the village alehouse, the creature had sunk its claws into the medieval imagination, not because anyone had actually seen one, but because the image was so well crafted, so well circulated, and so perfectly tied to fear and morality that it didn't matter. By the time the cockatrice had strutted its way into the medieval imagination, it was no longer confined to the rarefied pages of bestiaries or the sermons of scholarly clergy. It had become a fireside story, a warning whispered in dimly lit taverns, and a superstition lurking in the back of farmers' minds as they tended their flocks. In other words, the cockatrice had gone viral, without the benefit of social media or even a printing press. And unlike most medieval fads, this one had real staying power. If you were a villager in 13th or 14th century Europe, your daily life was already filled with anxiety, famine, plague, bad harvests, and the occasional Viking raid, if you were unlucky enough to live in certain parts, meant that worry was your constant companion. So when someone added death chicken that can kill you with a look to the already long list of things that could end your day, it didn't seem especially implausible. After all, people believed storms were caused by witches and toothaches came from little worms gnawing inside your gums. In that worldview, a rooster-snake hybrid sounded par for the course. Superstition was the fuel that kept the cockatrice alive in the popular imagination. Villagers might not have seen one themselves, but their cousin's neighbor's uncle swore he had. The story always came second-hand, always with just enough detail to sound convincing. It had the body of a snake, the wings of a bat, and eyes that glowed like hellfire. My cousin's goat looked at it once and keeled over, dead as salted pork. No one questioned why the goat hadn't been preserved as evidence, or why no one else happened to witness it. Medieval Europe wasn't big on fact-checking. If the tale was told by a priest or retold by a travelling bard, then it was treated as good as gospel. Taverns played a big role in the circulation of these stories. Imagine a group of weary farmers drinking their ale after a long day of back-breaking labour. One of them begins a tale about a rooster that hatched a snake egg and gave birth to a monster. The others, already tipsy and in the mood for a good scare, lean in. By the end of the night, the cockatrice is no longer a distant rumour. It's practically lurking outside the tavern door. Alcohol and imagination, it turns out, are excellent breeding grounds for monsters. Churches, too, had a hand in spreading cockatrice lore. Preachers loved using it as a symbol of sin, death, or Satan's trickery. Picture a stern friar wagging his finger at a congregation. Beware pride, lest ye become like the cockatrice, whose gaze alone brings ruin. Congregants might nod solemnly, but what really stuck in their minds wasn't the lesson on pride. It was the image of a mutant rooster staring people into oblivion. In this way, sermons became accidental monster manuals. And while superstition thrived on fear, it also thrived on imagination. The cockatrice was malleable. Some said it could kill with its breath, others insisted it was only the eyes. Some claimed it shrieked so loud it shattered bones, while others believed its venom soaked the very soil it touched. This flexibility helped the myth spread. No matter what went wrong in a village, whether it was livestock keeling over, milk spoiling, or a well-running fowl, someone could pin the blame on a cockatrice lurking nearby. It was the perfect scapegoat, terrifying, invisible, and conveniently unverifiable. The beauty or horror of folklore is that once a story takes root, it grows like ivy, twisting itself into the cracks of daily life. In some regions, people carried amulets to ward off cockatrices. In others, a rooster crowing at the wrong time of day was taken as a bad omen, a sign the beast might be near. Even ordinary chicken eggs became suspicious. A particularly small or oddly shaped egg might not just be dismissed as funny-looking, it might be taken as a potential cockatrice egg, prompting someone to destroy it before it could hatch into calamity. The line between barnyard poultry and nightmare fuel blurred quickly. Why did people cling so fiercely to the cockatrice myth despite never seeing one? The answer lies in a cocktail of fear and imagination. In a world with limited science and endless hazards, stories gave shape to anxieties. Better to believe a monster caused your troubles than to face the randomness of disease, death, and disaster. The cockatrice, absurd as it was, offered explanation and order, however terrifying. And let's be honest, it also made for a much better tavern story than my goat just got old and died. In many ways, the cockatrice illustrates the medieval motto, "Don't fact-check me, bro." Belief was its own proof, reinforced every time the story was retold. Each listener added their own dramatic flair until the cockatrice became larger, deadlier, and more convincing than ever. By the time you heard the tale for the 100th time, it wasn't a question of whether cockatrices existed. It was only a matter of whether one was hiding in your own village well. By the late Renaissance, the cockatrice's reign of terror began to crumble under the crushing weight of reason, microscopes, and people finally washing their hands more often. For centuries, this ridiculous death chicken was considered a genuine threat, an unholy hybrid that could kill you with a look, a breath, or a touch. But like most medieval monsters, its fate was sealed the moment scholars started poking around with actual science, instead of depending on rumor, superstition, and a tavern drunk's "I swear I saw it" testimony. The unraveling began with the rise of natural history. Early modern scholars like Ulisse Aldrovandi and Konrad Gesner started cataloguing animals, trying to separate fact from creative medieval doodle. When faced with the cockatrice, they weren't entirely sure what to do. On one hand, respected manuscripts swore it was real. On the other, no one could ever provide a live specimen that wasn't, well, just a chicken. Eventually the scales tipped in favor of okay, maybe this is just nonsense. The rooster egg plus snake hatching myth began looking more like a farmer's excuse for why his hens weren't laying properly than a zoological discovery. The final nail in the coffin came with advances in biology. Once people understood eggs a little better and that snakes don't moonlight as midwives for chickens, the cockatrice's biological credibility disintegrated. Dissection, taxonomy, and a broader knowledge of reptiles and birds stripped away the monster's mystique. And so the cockatrice went from genuine countryside panic to that silly thing our grandparents used to believe in, like fairies or medicinal leeches. But here's the thing about monsters. They rarely die clean deaths. Instead, they evolve into cultural curiosities. Once stripped of its fear factor, the cockatrice slipped into the background of literature and art, living on as a handy metaphor. Writers used it to represent sin, pride, or the foolishness of human imagination. Painters kept sketching them because, let's be honest, who doesn't love the visual absurdity of a rooster dragon with homicidal tendencies? Heraldry, too, grabbed hold of it. Families and towns plastered cockatrices on shields and banners as a symbol of ferocity. Never mind that the creature was more barnyard embarrassment than battlefield terror. From there, the cockatrice survived the centuries not as a beast that kept people awake at night, but as a quirky legacy of how easily humans once blurred the line between fact and fantasy. By the Victorian era, it was often treated with amused nostalgia. Folklorists collected cockatrice tales alongside stories of elves, witches, and banshees, strange relics of a time when your biggest predator might not have claws but a deadly case of bad breath. Of course, in modern times, the cockatrice has enjoyed a second life in unexpected places. Role-playing games, novels, and fantasy franchises dusted it off and gave it fresh teeth. Sometimes literally, Dungeons and Dragons players know it well. Not quite dragon, not quite chicken, but always a problem. Even Pokémon borrowed from its lineage because nothing says fun like training your own personal rooster lizard. And so a monster that once sent medieval villagers scrambling for their weasels now inspires laughter, nostalgia, and mid-level boss fights. It's worth remembering, though, that the cockatrice's story isn't just about a monster, it's about the way humans believe. Once upon a time, its deadly gaze was as real to people as fire or famine. Its existence was validated not by proof but by repetition. It was in the books, it was in the art, and it was in the whispers of your neighbors. And for a world that often felt hostile and incomprehensible, believing in monsters was oddly comforting. Better to think there's a reason behind misfortune, be it a cockatrice's breath or a cursed egg, than to face the chaos of randomness. And so the cockatrice lives on, not as a predator but as a parable. It warns us about the dangers of taking stories at face value, about how fear fills the gaps where knowledge falters. But it also reminds us that even the most absurd myths can be strangely enduring. After all, medieval peasants feared it. Modern gamers? They just call it Tuesday's dungeon crawl. The death chicken has been downgraded from apocalyptic threat to nostalgic punchline, yet it continues to flap around our cultural imagination, crowing at us from the margins of history. So the next time you stumble across a medieval manuscript showing a rooster with a dragon tail glaring at a peasant, remember, that wasn't just an illustration, that was once someone's nightmare. A creature as real as wolves or plague. Today, it's nothing more than a quirky mascot of human gullibility, a reminder that truth is often stranger and funnier than fiction. If you've ever complained that your hotel pillow felt like a rock, congratulations, you've just reenacted the Mesopotamian sleep experience. Because for some of humanity's earliest civilizations, pillow didn't mean soft, fluffy cloud for your weary head. It meant exactly what it sounds like, a block of carved stone. Yes, the first people to invent writing, irrigation, and the wheel also thought a literal rock was the key to sweet dreams, Either these folks had necks of steel or they secretly hated comfort. The Mesopotamian stone pillow was carved with a gentle curve to cradle the head, though calling it gentle is like calling sandpaper spa treatment. It wasn't designed to soothe your spine so much as to keep your head slightly elevated, off the ground, and away from pests. Think of it less as memory foam and more as pest control technology. The idea was simple. Bugs, rodents, or other creepy crawlies were less likely to crawl into your nose, ears, or mouth if you were balanced on a mini rock podium. Modern science may give us bug spray, but in the Bronze Age, granite was the solution. The Egyptians, of course, took this rocky sleep trend and gave it their signature flair. Instead of pillows, they used elegant wooden or stone headrests, small stands that lifted the head several inches above the mat. These weren't really for comfort either, because lying on a curved slab of acacia wood isn't anyone's idea of relaxation. The purpose was hygiene and preservation. You see, Egypt was hot, and when you've shaved your head bald or wear an elaborate wig, the last thing you want is sweat pooling into your linens. A headrest kept airflow circulating around your skull, protecting both your dignity and your favorite wig. Basically, it was the first ventilated cooling pillow, just without the softness or the guarantee of an intact neck in the morning. But the Egyptian headrest wasn't just practical, it carried symbolism too. In art and tombs, headrests were linked to life, death, and rebirth. Some were carved with protective deities like Bez, the dwarf god who scared away evil spirits, and apparently neck cramps. To the Egyptians, raising the head during sleep was a way of preparing the soul for its nightly journey into the dream world. And if you think dreams were just about random nonsense, not to them. Dreams were divine messages. Your pillow wasn't simply furniture. It was a spiritual antenna, tuned to the frequencies of the gods. Imagine if you could buy one at IKEA with a label that read, Model Headrest 2000. Function prevents bugs, connects to afterlife. Across cultures, the pillow was never merely about comfort, it was status. If you owned a finely carved headrest or an ornate stone pillow, you weren't just rich in dreams, you were rich in real life. Mesopotamian elites and Egyptian nobles had their sleeping gear crafted in ivory, ebony, or even precious metals, because even in slumber, luxury was expected. This wasn't about catching better sleep. It was about showing that you were important enough for your head to rest on something that could also double as an art piece. Meanwhile, peasants were probably just happy with a folded-up cloak. The wealth gap was alive and well in bedtime accessories. But what's fascinating is how these early societies tied pillows to health and superstition. In Mesopotamia, the elevated head was thought to protect not just against scorpions but against disease, because evil spirits were believed to attack people lying vulnerable on the ground. Elevation meant protection. Think of it as ancient germ theory mixed with spiritual paranoia. Egyptians, too, buried their dead with headrests, so that even in the afterlife you wouldn't risk a bedhead moment, because apparently death was no excuse to stop looking presentable. So while you toss and turn at night trying to fluff your pillow into the perfect shape, remember, the first humans to figure out agriculture and written law were sleeping on stones by choice. Their idea of a luxury bedding upgrade wasn't down feathers or latex foam. It was simply a slightly smoother rock. And if you asked them about comfort, they'd probably look at you and say, "Comfort? Who has time for that when you're trying to keep demons and scarabs out of your nose?" What's both hilarious and humbling is that these civilizations didn't even see pillows as something you should enjoy. The pillow was more like a seatbelt for your dreams, a device that kept you upright, protected, and aligned with cosmic order, even if it gave you a crick in the neck that lasted all day. And so, the humble pillow begins its journey in human history, not as a soft refuge for weary heads, but as a tool of survival, status, and spirituality. It wasn't yet the plush bedtime essential we know today. It was a rock, a symbol, and sometimes even a magical object. The road from stone slabs to silk cushions was still a long one, but humanity had taken its first, albeit stiff-necked step toward the dream of ultimate sleep comfort. If the last part taught us anything, It's that the earliest pillows were less cozy head cradles and more expensive rocks people justified sleeping on. But as human civilization advanced, so too did the idea of resting your head in style. By the time we step into the world of ancient Mesopotamia, China, Greece and Rome, the pillow had transformed from a symbol of "you won't get a beetle crawling in your ear tonight" into a full-blown status marker. Simply put, if you had a soft place to rest your head in antiquity, you were probably the kind of person who didn't have to do your own laundry. Let's start where civilization itself got rolling. Mesopotamia. By the time the Mesopotamians were building ziggurats and scribbling on clay tablets, they were also experimenting with different pillow designs. But here's the catch: not everyone got to enjoy them. Pillows in Mesopotamia were often crafted from wood, alabaster, or ivory, meaning they were luxury items only the elite could afford. Imagine lying down after a long day of ruling your city-state and having your head cushioned by carved ivory while your subjects used their arm, a sack of dirt, or just the floor. Nothing says "I'm better than you" quite like an engraved wooden block for your skull. But pillows weren't just about status, they had spiritual significance too. The Mesopotamians believed the head was the most sacred part of the body, the seat of the soul. Placing your head on something elevated and ritually important wasn't just comfortable, it was cosmic protection. A fancy pillow wasn't merely a headrest, it was a soul-guarding artifact, like a nightstand made by your local priest. Now, if there's one civilization that turned pillows into an art form, it was ancient China. Forget feathers and fluff. These folks were all about jade. Yes, jade pillows, polished smooth and carved with decorative patterns, were the ultimate luxury. They weren't designed to make you feel cozy, though. Jade was believed to hold mystical health benefits. It was said to improve circulation, sharpen the mind, and even transfer spiritual energy to the sleeper. In other words, if you went to bed on a jade pillow, you weren't just napping, you were upgrading your chi. Porcelain pillows were another fashionable option, often painted with intricate scenes of flowers, dragons, or scholars looking deep in thought, probably because they were awake at 3 a.m., unable to sleep on their rock-hard porcelain headrest. To the Chinese elite, however, the discomfort was worth it. A beautiful pillow wasn't about a good night's sleep. It was a lifestyle statement, the ancient equivalent of saying, "I drive a Tesla." Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the Greeks and Romans took a different approach. They went soft. While their Eastern counterparts were polishing jade, the Greeks were stuffing cloth sacks with reeds, wool, or even feathers. For the first time in history, pillows started looking like the things we actually recognize today. But don't get too excited. This comfort revolution was still reserved for the wealthy. If you were a Greek philosopher or Roman senator, you got to recline dramatically on a cushioned headrest while debating politics. If you were a slave or a poor farmer, you got to use the ground. For the Romans especially, pillows weren't just for sleep. They were a key part of social life. Picture a Roman feast, men in togas, lounging sideways on couches, propped up by cushions while servants brought trays of roasted peacocks and wine. It wasn't just a party. It was a performance of wealth and refinement. Owning a pillow was one thing. Being able to recline on a mountain of them while stuffing your face with grapes was another. What's clear from all this is that pillows were a dividing line between classes. For the wealthy, pillows were symbols of refinement, intellect, and even divine favor. They were decorated, carved, or embroidered to show off wealth and artistry. For the poor, the best you could hope for was maybe a bundle of reeds, or if you were really lucky, your livestock's straw pile. The pillow gap was as glaring as the difference between someone in Beverly Hills and someone living paycheck to paycheck today. And this divide wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Pillows, like jewelry or fine robes, carried meaning. A Roman with a pillow was someone who had the time to relax, to read, to recline, to be above the struggle of daily life. A Chinese noble resting on jade declared their wisdom and virtue. A Mesopotamian king with an ivory pillow announced their cosmic authority. Pillows, in short, were propaganda for the bedroom. Here's the irony in all of this. The fancier the pillow, the less comfortable it usually was. Jade? Cold and hard. Porcelain, fragile and slick. Ivory, about as soft as your dining table. Even the Greek and Roman stuffed pillows weren't exactly goose-down perfection. Reeds and wool could get lumpy fast, so while these ancient elites were making statements with their pillows, they weren't exactly getting 8 hours of cozy slumber. In many ways, the rich were sacrificing sleep quality for aesthetics, something that, come to think of it, still hasn't gone out of style. Ultimately, the story of pillows in ancient Mesopotamia, China, Greece and Rome isn't really about sleep, it's about status. A pillow wasn't just where you laid your head at night, it was a reflection of who you were in life. For some it was protection of the soul, for others a conduit for health, and for many a way of saying, I'm not like those floor sleepers. So, while today we take for granted the idea that pillows are for comfort, back then they were about making a point. That point might have been, I'm wise, I'm powerful, or simply I'm richer than you. But the message was clear. Your pillow said more about your status than your bed ever did. The good news, by this point in history, at least some people were finally sleeping on something soft. The bad news, most weren't, and the fluffy life was still centuries away from becoming a universal right. If you were a medieval European and someone offered you a soft pillow, you might have needed to check whether it was a trap for your soul. You see, in the Middle Ages, pillows weren't just innocent bedtime accessories, they were battlegrounds for morality, masculinity, and a touch of ecclesiastical judgment. What we think of today as the most basic sleep luxury was, for medieval Europeans, either a symbol of decadence or a hay-stuffed, neck-twisting compromise that made sleep less about relaxation and more about survival. Let's start with the church, because in medieval Europe, the church always had something to say about your bedtime habits. Believe it or not, some religious authorities outright frowned upon pillows. Their reasoning? If you needed one, you were probably soft, sinful, or both. Christian doctrine during the Middle Ages emphasized suffering, humility, and denial of worldly comforts. So the logic went that if Christ carried the cross without a goose-feather pillow, so could you. There are records of monks, priests, and other holy figures deliberately avoiding pillows to embrace discomfort as a sign of piety. Sleeping flat on a hard surface was proof of discipline. Adding a cushion under your head, that was veering dangerously close to luxury, if not outright vanity. And vanity, as medieval preachers loved to remind the masses, was a gateway sin. Better to wake up with a stiff neck than with a reputation for moral weakness. If religion didn't bully you out of enjoying a pillow, masculinity might. In a society where knights, warriors, and kings were supposed to embody toughness, needing a pillow was basically announcing, my neck is delicate. And in the Middle Ages, delicacy was not a bragging point. Chronicles and satirical writings poked fun at men who enjoyed too many pillows. To some it was almost effeminate. After all, if you were strong enough to survive the crusades, jousts, and the occasional plague outbreak, surely you could make it through the night without cradling your head on a feather sack. Knights who indulged were teased, and kings who requested an extra bolster at court risked whispers behind their backs. Pillows, in short, were dangerous to reputations. For the average medieval household, the pillow situation was bleak. The wealthiest could afford bolsters or cushions stuffed with feathers, but these were rare luxuries. Most households got by with sacks filled with hay, straw, or wool. Think of them as proto-pillows, functional in theory, but likely lumpy, scratchy, and prone to housing insects. Imagine resting your head on what was basically a burlap bag of barnyard leftovers. Bolsters, long, cylindrical cushions were more common than individual head pillows. They provided some elevation and could be shared by more than one sleeper, since privacy wasn't exactly a medieval bedroom priority. These bolsters weren't soft or refined, but they did keep your head out of direct contact with a wooden bed frame or cold stone floor. A victory, however small. In the medieval imagination, pillows became shorthand for indulgence. The satirical poet John Skelton once mocked nobles who slept with piles of soft cushions, suggesting they were no better than overfed cats. Records also show that in some courts, jesters would tease lords about their bedding habits. Ah yes, the mighty knight who slew enemies by day but needs 4 geese under his head to sleep by night. It was a classic case of bedtime shame. Women, interestingly, faced less scorn for pillow use. Soft bedding was often associated with childbearing or women's quarters, where practicality sometimes outweighed the strict codes of masculine toughness. But even here, pillows were not mass-produced or widely available. They remained a rare commodity. If you had one, you guarded it carefully, since feather sacks were expensive and time-consuming to make. Despite the church's frowns and the nightly pillow shaming, wealthy medieval elites did sometimes indulge in softer sleep. Nobility might own elaborately decorated cushions filled with goose down, covered in fine linens or even embroidered fabric. These weren't just about comfort. They were symbols of wealth. Much like gold plates on the dining table or silk robes at a feast, pillows showed off your ability to purchase luxury. Of course, flaunting them came with the risk of ridicule. A nobleman might own a cushion so finely made it was practically a crown for the head, but if he bragged too loudly about it, someone was bound to accuse him of weakness. Thus, pillows lived in a strange limbo, desirable for their status value but dangerous for your reputation. One thing to remember is that medieval sleep culture itself was very different from ours. Sleep was segmented, often broken into 2 phases with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Comfort wasn't the top priority. Survival was. With drafty stone castles, bed bugs and straw mattresses that sagged after a few weeks, the pillow was hardly going to rescue your rest. It was just one small, often ignored accessory in a larger nightly struggle against cold, vermin and noise. So, if medieval pillows weren't about comfort, what were they about? In many ways they were symbols. To some they represented weakness, to others wealth. For the majority they were a dream that stayed just out of reach, like indoor plumbing or food that didn't come with a side of dysentery. When you hear the phrase medieval torture device, your mind probably jumps to racks and iron maidens, but arguably, some of the worst neck pain in history came not from the dungeon but from the bedroom. The Middle Ages managed to make something as simple as resting your head into a minefield of morality, reputation and discomfort. The good news? The age of pillow shaming wouldn't last forever. Renaissance innovators, global trade, and shifting cultural attitudes would eventually soften Europe's stance on bedtime comfort. But during the medieval centuries, the pillow wasn't your friend. It was your reputation's enemy, your priest's nightmare, and your chiropractor's dream patient. If medieval Europe was busy debating whether pillows were a sinful indulgence, the East had already turned them into a whole cultural philosophy. Pillows in China, Japan, and the broader Islamic world weren't just about the neck. They were about the soul, the spirit, the body, and sometimes your hairstyle. And unlike Europe's stuff a sack with straw and pray your spine doesn't collapse approach, Eastern traditions developed unique, practical, and often symbolic reasons to keep a pillow close at hand, even if it wasn't exactly fluffy. Take China, for example. The Chinese had long since decided that sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a mystical experience, one where dreams and the body's internal energy were deeply intertwined. That's why their pillows weren't always soft or even remotely comfortable by modern standards. Jade pillows, porcelain pillows, even lacquered wooden pillows. These were popular for centuries. Imagine laying your head on a polished ceramic block, cool in summer, freezing in winter, and universally unfriendly to the concept of sweet dreams. But the Chinese weren't thinking in terms of snuggle factor. These pillows were believed to influence health, regulate qi, life force, and even encourage better dreams. A jade pillow wasn't just an expensive chunk of mineral. It was supposed to keep evil spirits at bay and promote wisdom, essentially doubling as both a wellness product and a talisman. And then there was the problem of hair. In societies where hair wasn't just a personal choice but a cultural statement, you couldn't risk waking up with your painstakingly crafted style flattened into chaos. This was particularly important in Japan, where women's elaborate coiffures made modern-day hairspray look like child's play. The solution? The takamakara, or high pillow. It was less a pillow and more a wooden stand with a padded top, designed to keep the head slightly elevated so the hair remained perfect overnight. To a modern observer, this might look more like a medieval torture device than a pillow, but for centuries it was the secret weapon behind immaculate hairstyles. Comfort was secondary, beauty was eternal. China, too, saw pillows as more than neck rests. Many were inscribed with blessings, imagery of animals, or Taoist symbols meant to influence the sleeper's fortunes. A porcelain pillow decorated with tigers wasn't just a quirky bed accessory. It was thought to give the dreamer courage. A lotus-shaped pillow. Purity. In this sense, pillows doubled as personalized dream machines, curated with designs that reflected spiritual or personal goals. They were as much about who you wanted to be as they were about how you wanted to sleep. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, pillows took on a completely different identity. Instead of prioritizing hard surfaces or hair-saving devices, they embraced softness and style. Pillows became an integral part of daily life, not just for sleeping but for sitting, reclining, and creating luxurious interiors. If you picture an opulent medieval court in the Islamic Golden Age, you don't imagine chairs, you imagine cushions and pillows, richly embroidered, piled high on carpets, serving as everything from seating arrangements to status symbols. The artistry was astonishing. Intricate woven patterns, bright dyes, and calligraphic designs that turned what we'd call throw pillows into masterpieces. A guest entering such a room wasn't just sitting down, they were literally sinking into an atmosphere of wealth and refinement. Pillows here also blurred the line between practicality and art. They could be used as gifts, tokens of status, or signs of hospitality. Offering a guest a pillow wasn't simply about comfort. It was an invitation into a world of refinement, much like offering fine wine or a carefully prepared meal. In fact, the very architecture of Islamic interiors was often designed with pillows in mind, emphasizing open spaces and low furniture where cushions and bolsters did all the work of comfort. If Europe's medieval peasants had stumbled into one of these rooms, they might have fainted from shock or jealousy. What's fascinating is how differently each culture approached the same object. In Japan, the pillow was functional, keep the hair intact at all costs. In China, it was spiritual, channel dreams and health through form and material. In the Islamic world, it was social, create a space of beauty, community, and luxury. Yet despite these vast differences, the pillow remained central, always more than just a headrest, always more than just something to keep you off the floor. It became a reflection of values, lifestyles, and priorities, and in each case, comfort was never really the main event. If you had to sleep on a porcelain pillow or balance your head on a lacquered block tonight, you'd probably scream into your memory foam about how lucky you are. But in the Middle Ages, across the East, those uncomfortable designs carried meaning, symbolism, and artistry that elevated them far above mere sleep aids. These weren't pillows you drooled on in your sleep. They were artifacts that told the world who you were, what you valued, and what dreams you hoped to dream. Now that we've seen how the East gave pillows both spiritual weight and artistic flair, it's time to ask what happens when the Renaissance and the following centuries turn sleeping into a status contest. Do pillows finally start getting comfortable, or do they just get more decorative and ridiculous? By the time the Renaissance dawned, Europe had begun dusting itself off from the gloom of the Middle Ages and rediscovering all the nice little pleasures in life, like art, science, and not dying of plague quite as often. Among these rediscoveries was the idea that perhaps, just maybe, it was okay to want a bit of comfort while you slept. After centuries where pillows were eyed with suspicion, thanks to medieval monks wagging their fingers and declaring that soft heads bred weak souls, the tide slowly began to turn. But like everything else in this period of grand change, pillows didn't just slip quietly into bedrooms. They marched back in amid controversy, gender rules, embroidered peacocking, and the endless European obsession with showing off wealth. One of the strangest quirks of the Renaissance pillow revival was that it came with a clear set of rules about who was allowed to indulge in softness. Women and children? Absolutely. They were seen as fragile beings in need of protection, so giving them a cushion for their delicate heads was practically a public service. Men, however, were told to toughen up and leave their necks to fend for themselves. If you were a Renaissance man who admitted to liking more than one pillow, you might as well have tattooed weakling across your forehead. To many, the idea of a grown man using a fluffy headrest was uncomfortably close to vanity, a trait that society insisted was unbecoming of virile masculinity. This bizarre double standard meant that households often had pillows on hand, but they were distributed unevenly, with husbands dutifully pretending their bare mattress was perfectly fine, while their wives and children rested in relative comfort. But men didn't get off the hook entirely. While they may have sneered at soft sleeping pillows, many Renaissance nobles and merchants were quite happy to surround themselves with a growing trend: decorative cushions. These weren't designed for bedtime, but for making a grand visual impression in the spaces where guests might see them. That's where pillows really began to shift in purpose. They weren't just about supporting a weary neck anymore. They became part of the furniture, both literally and socially. Picture an elaborate Renaissance chamber, complete with carved wooden chairs that looked like medieval torture devices. Without a cushion, you'd sit on bare oak, which was fine if you were a stoic monk, but hardly appealing for the well-dressed lady showing off her new velvet gown. Enter the decorative pillow, which turned otherwise severe furniture into something tolerable and, more importantly, fashionable. And fashionable they were. This was an era when textiles carried enormous social weight. A pillow was no longer just a stuffed sack, but an opportunity to flaunt your family's wealth and taste. The covers became canvases for embroidered crests, floral designs, or even biblical scenes painstakingly stitched by hand. Expensive fabrics like velvet, damask, and silk were favored, often in jewel tones that shouted, "We can afford to sit on imported luxury, and you can't." The filling, too, could signal wealth. Goose down was the gold standard, reserved for those who had the money to wrangle flocks of geese purely for their feathers. Everyone else had to settle for more modest fillings like wool, horsehair, or even chopped rags. The Renaissance also brought a new tension into the pillow debate, the conflict between function and display. A pillow might be gorgeously embroidered, but if you actually leaned on it, the delicate stitching could fray. So many cushions were made less for comfort and more as a visual brag. They sat proudly in drawing rooms and parlors, never to be squashed by the indignity of human weight. In a way, these were the ancestors of today's decorative throw pillows, those colorful squares that people place on couches, but never actually allow anyone to touch. The Renaissance loved pillows so much, it made some of them completely useless. Interestingly, pillows in this era also mirrored larger cultural shifts. As Europe reconnected with the wider world through trade, new fabrics and ideas flowed in. Ottoman textiles, with their intricate patterns and bright colors, influenced European taste, making decorative cushions even more popular. Owning a brightly woven pillow wasn't just about comfort, it was a small slice of global prestige. It signaled that you had access to exotic goods, whether through trade routes or a very successful cousin in Venice. But pillows were also caught in the slow grind of changing moral attitudes. While Renaissance thinkers were busy rediscovering ancient philosophy and celebrating humanism, many still clung to medieval moral hang-ups. Comfort could still be seen as indulgence as sin. For some conservative voices, too many pillows represented decadence, a slippery slope that might lead straight to spiritual ruin. This lingering suspicion meant pillows carried a strange reputation: luxurious, desirable, but never fully innocent. Despite these cultural battles, pillows were firmly entrenched in European households by the early modern period. By the 17th century, inventories of wealthy estates often listed dozens of cushions and bolsters, sometimes covered in fabrics so ornate they were worth more than the furniture underneath. Pillows even began to appear in portraits, painted alongside noble sitters as subtle indicators of refinement. Imagine the Renaissance version of an influencer strategically placing designer handbags in the background of their selfies. Pillows were props of prestige, quiet yet powerful. At the same time, the association of pillows with women persisted, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing for embroidery skills. Girls were often taught to embroider by practicing on pillow covers, meaning these household objects doubled as both art pieces and training grounds for domestic craftsmanship. The result? A world where pillows were as much about needlework education as they were about resting a weary head. So, while knights and merchants may have scoffed at using too many bedtime cushions, the Renaissance still staged a comfort revolution. Pillows didn't just return to bedrooms, they colonized drawing rooms, banquet halls, and even art. They were as much about social image as they were about sleep, proving that in the war between practicality and prestige, softness always finds a way to sneak back in. If there's one thing you can count on with the Victorians, it's that they never knew when to stop. If one pillow was good, then surely 10 would be better, and if you could stack them high enough to make your bed look like a fabric avalanche, then you were truly living the dream. By the 19th century, pillows were no longer merely a thing you tucked under your head at night. They had become soldiers in an army of lace, embroidery, and scented excess. The Victorians adored their pillows with the same zeal they applied to wallpaper, table settings, and facial hair. Nothing was ever too much. Let's start with the basics. The humble bed pillow. In Victorian households, even a modest bed often looked more like an altar to textile artistry than a place to sleep. Pillows were stacked high, layered with cases trimmed in lace and ruffles so elaborate they could probably double as parachutes. Some were stuffed with down, others with horsehair, and for those who wanted firm support, the occasional wool-filled option existed. Of course, the truly fashionable house wouldn't be caught dead without pillowcases embroidered with delicate floral motifs or initials, because nothing said "we have money" quite like falling asleep on your own monogram. But the Victorian love affair with pillows wasn't confined to the bedroom. They spread into the parlour, the drawing room, the library, and anywhere else a guest might sit. The decorative cushion, better known today as the throw pillow, staged its grand debut in the 19th century. Small, square, and often pointlessly adorned, these pillows were less about comfort and more about proving that your family could afford both frivolity and furniture. Guests didn't actually lean on them. Heaven forbid you wrinkle the embroidery or flatten the ruffles. Instead, they were strategically placed like tiny fabric landmines across sofas and chairs, daring visitors to figure out where to sit without toppling the arrangement. And then there were the perfumed pillows. That's right, some Victorians thought it wasn't enough for pillows to look extravagant, they also had to smell extravagant. These delicate cushions were stuffed with dried lavender, rose petals or herbs, designed to release a refreshing aroma when leaned upon. In theory, this added an air of refinement to any room. In practice, it probably made you feel like you were suffocating in a flower shop while wearing 5 layers of corsets. But remember, this was the same era that thought arsenic was a lovely addition to green wallpaper, so a pillow that smelled like grandma's garden was downright sensible. Of course, mass production changed the pillow game entirely. With the rise of factories and cheaper textiles, even middle-class families could suddenly afford pillows that looked like they belonged in a palace. The wealthy responded by doubling down, commissioning pillows made of silk, brocade, or velvet, with embellishments of gold thread and tassels thick enough to be used as weapons. Meanwhile, factory-made cotton cases allowed ordinary households to enjoy pillow comfort without breaking the bank. The difference wasn't in having pillows anymore. It was in how absurdly fancy they could be. Men, however, still maintained a complicated relationship with pillows. Old prejudices hadn't fully vanished. A gentleman might rest his head on one at night, but don't expect him to be enthusiastic about lace-trimmed frippery in his personal quarters. Pillows in men's studies or smoking rooms were simpler, darker fabrics, sturdier shapes, and less fuss. Still, the sheer infiltration of pillows into every space meant that even the most stoic Victorian male couldn't entirely escape the tidal wave of fabric. One can only imagine the horror of a grizzled army officer sitting stiffly on a sofa buried beneath rose-scented cushions while his host beamed proudly. What's fascinating is how pillows in this era began to embody an entirely new social function, signaling respectability. To have an abundance of decorative pillows was to show that your household was orderly, tasteful, and economically secure. They were part of a broader Victorian obsession with curating appearances. Just as heavily patterned wallpaper and endless china knickknacks crowded their homes, pillows provided yet another way to prove refinement. A sofa without a cushion was practically indecent, like serving tea without sugar or going out without a hat. And because the Victorians couldn't resist a good invention, some pillows came with unusual improvements. There were travel pillows shaped like bolsters for long carriage rides, or ones filled with herbs intended to ward off colds. There were sofa pillows specifically designed to prop ladies up while they reclined in awkward corseted poses, and novelty pillows in animal shapes to amuse children. Some particularly devoted households even had seasonal pillow covers, swapping out dark fabrics for winter and lighter ones for summer, because clearly society would crumble if your pillows weren't seasonally appropriate. By the late 19th century, the sheer proliferation of pillows had gone from comfort to comedy. Writers and satirists began poking fun at drawing rooms so full of cushions that no one could sit down comfortably. Guests were reduced to balancing on the edge of chairs, desperately trying not to squash the embroidered butterflies or disturb the careful arrangement. One witty critic compared them to an army of soft barricades, preventing both relaxation and freedom of movement. But of course, that was part of the charm. Victorian society thrived on a delicate dance of appearances, even if those appearances meant bruised ribs from sitting too close to tassels. In many ways, the Victorian pillow explosion set the stage for our modern obsession with decorative cushions. Walk into any home decor store today and you'll see the legacy of this era: endless shelves of throw pillows in every pattern imaginable, destined to frustrate anyone who just wants to sit on a couch without rearranging half a dozen fluffy obstacles. So while we might laugh at the Victorians and their lace-trimmed, perfumed, ruffle-heavy pillows, we have them to thank or blame for the culture of decorative excess that continues to haunt our living rooms. After all, every time you toss a throw pillow off the couch before sitting down, you're reenacting a tiny moment of Victorian domestic life. If a medieval monk could be transported to the 21st century, he would probably collapse, not from culture shock, but from the sheer avalanche of pillows stacked on every bed, sofa, and home goods store shelf. What began as Mesopotamian stone slabs has now spiraled into a full-blown industry that treats sleep like a competitive sport, and the main piece of equipment? The humble pillow, now rebranded as a health device, lifestyle choice, and sometimes an emotional crutch. Modern pillows are no longer just about cushioning your skull. They're about customization, optimization, and occasionally outright gimmickry. Walk into a mattress shop today, and you'll be greeted with options that sound more like military hardware than bedtime accessories. Memory foam, latex, cooling gel, shredded bamboo, microbeads, buckwheat hulls, charcoal-infused foam, and even pillows that promise to align your cervical spine with high-level precision. Somewhere along the way, our quest for neck comfort turned into an arms race, each company promising their product will give you the deepest, dreamiest sleep of your life, while gently hinting that without it, you may as well resign yourself to back pain and lifelong insomnia. Memory foam pillows were the first big revolution, developed from material originally designed by NASA in the 1960s. Memory foam cradles your head like a patient but overly clingy lover, molding to your shape and refusing to let go. Then came the cooling gel inserts, promising relief for the eternally overheated sleeper. No more flipping to the cold side of the pillow. These models offered constant freshness, though some users complained that the gel layer felt disturbingly like resting on a refrigerated steak. Latex pillows boasted springy resilience. Buckwheat hulls offered eco-friendly firmness, and bamboo promised to be both hypoallergenic and mysteriously natural, as though pandas had blessed it personally. But where there's innovation, there's also absurdity. Cue the rise of the so-called anti-snore pillow, engineered to keep your head tilted just enough to open up your airways. Some models even come with built-in vibration sensors that gently jolt you awake if you start snoring too loudly. A feature that seems both helpful and mildly vindictive. And for the truly lonely, there's the infamous boyfriend pillow, shaped like a muscular arm and chest, so you can snuggle with someone who never complains, sweats, or steals the blanket. Japan, never shy about pushing boundaries, has produced pillows shaped like giant shrimp, anime characters, or soft body-length dakimakura for maximum cuddling efficiency. In short, the line between comfort and comedy has never been thinner. What's perhaps most fascinating is how pillows have become part of the booming wellness industry. Companies don't just sell pillows, they sell promises. Buy this orthopedic pillow and your migraines will vanish. Invest in this cervical contour pillow and you'll finally wake up without neck pain. Upgrade to the tech-driven models and you'll be greeted with apps that track your breathing, measure your sleep cycles, and whisper ambient sounds to lull you into slumber. Some pillows even boast built-in speakers, so you can drift off to music or podcasts without disturbing your partner. Though whether anyone truly dreams better with jazz clarinet directly under their ear is up for debate. And of course, no modern comfort product is complete without influencer marketing. Instagram feeds overflow with aesthetically arranged beds featuring 10 to 15 decorative throw pillows, all perfectly color coordinated. Interior designers insist that no living room is complete without a mountain of cushions on the sofa, ensuring that guests must awkwardly excavate a spot just to sit down. The decorative pillow, once a Victorian novelty, has become an unstoppable cultural phenomenon, now spilling onto everything from porch furniture to dog beds. Humanity may be divided by politics, culture, and geography, but when it comes to overstuffing our homes with pillows, we are united. Ironically, despite all this innovation, many people still wake up with cricked necks, flattened hair, or that familiar pillow crease stamped across their face. No matter how many ergonomic claims are printed on the box, the truth is that pillows remain deeply personal. What feels like a cloud to one sleeper may feel like a suffocating marshmallow to another, and so the cycle continues. Humanity endlessly tinkering, redesigning, and refluffing in search of that elusive perfect night's rest. Which brings us full circle. Thousands of years ago, Mesopotamians believed their stone pillows would protect them from demons while they slept. Today we just want something that won't give us back pain before the alarm rings. But whether it's jade, straw, lace, or memory foam, one thing has remained constant. The pillow is proof of humanity's eternal optimism. We always believe that if we can just get the right cushion under our head, tomorrow will be a little brighter. And so the arms race continues. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that humans will never stop trying to get comfortable.